Good morning, everyone. Happy spring. And for sportsmen, happy first day to look at big game applications. I'd like to call this meeting of the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Natural Resources to order. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. First of all, I'd like to note that we are convening this meeting from the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Nuwu people, or Southern Paiute. And we are also teleconferencing and have members joining from the ancestral homelands of the Nuwu, the Nui, or Western Shoshone, Numu, or Northern Paiute, and Washishu, or Washoe peoples. Currently represented by 27 sovereign tribes that are located wholly or partially within the state, and recognize the stewardship that they have provided to our lands and waters since time immemorial. For members that are joining us virtually, please be sure to keep your video on so that we know we have a quorum, and please be sure to mute your microphone when you're not speaking in order to minimize background noise. And I would just like to note that today we have Assemblywoman Bilberry Axelrod joining us in place for Assemblywoman Peters. So with that, can we please call the roll?
Senator Goycochea.
Here.
Assemblyman Ellison. Assemblywoman Hanson.
Here.
Senator Doniate.
Here.
Senator Scheibel. Assemblywoman Carlton.
Here.
Assemblywoman Bilberry Axelrod for Assemblywoman Peters.
Here.
Chair Watts.
Here. Thank you. We have a quorum. Please mark Senator Scheibel present when she arrives. She is going to be running a little bit late today. Before we get into the rest of our agenda, I'd like to make a couple of other housekeeping announcements. I'm glad to announce that on the recommendation of the Intertribal Council of Nevada, Clifford Benuelos, the Tribal State Environmental Liaison for the Intertribal Council, will be joining the Subcommittee on Public Lands. During our interim, meetings usually have two periods for public comment, once at the beginning and once at the end of the meeting. Members of the public may provide testimony in many different ways, all of which are listed on our agenda, and we are glad to offer the ability for people to provide public comment in person. Glad to be back here in person as well. If you'd like to call in for public testimony, dial 669-900-6833. When prompted, provide the meeting ID 870-5012-2791 and then press pound. Our broadcast and production services staff will indicate to you when it's your turn to speak. We ask that public comment made in person or by phone be kept to 3 minutes so that everyone interested in speaking can be accommodated and to ensure we get through the agenda in a timely fashion. Speakers are urged to avoid repetition of comments made by others. If you'd like to provide written comments, you can submit them electronically before, during, or after the meeting by email to nrinterim@lcb.state.nv.us or mail them to the Research Division at 401 South Carson Street, Carson City, Nevada, 89701. Lastly, you can fax them to 775-684-6400. So with that, we'll start with the first item on our agenda today, which is public comment. Please remember when providing public comment to clearly state and spell your name and limit your remarks to 3 minutes. We'll start with in person. Do we have anyone wishing to provide public comment either here in Las Vegas or in Carson City? Seeing none in Las Vegas. Anyone in Carson City?
It doesn't
All
appear
right,
so,
also
Mr.
seeing-
Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator. Appreciate that. With that, we'll now take any public comment by phone. Staff in our broadcast production services, can we see if we have anybody wishing to provide public comment by phone?
First Chair, to provide public comment, please press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. Caller, you are unmuted.
Chairman Watts and members of the committee, I am Kyle Roerink, Executive Director of the Great Basin Water Network. Thank you for having us here today, and thank you for focusing on this important subject matter. I don't need to tell you that we are experiencing the worst drought in 1,200 years, nor do I need to remind you that our cities are among the fastest growing places in the arid West. When I am out in the field with farmers, tribal members, conservationists, and others, there's one consistent thing I hear. Things aren't what they once were. What I am here to say is that the decisions you all make between now and the end of next session, or in some cases don't make, will have lasting impacts long after we are all gone from this arena. I have some general comments focusing on two areas, the state of Nevada and its management of our 256 groundwater basins, and secondly, the water management in urban areas. As it relates to the state, the water-focused efforts in this body during the last 5 or 10 years have been acrimonious at times. That's because the efforts to revise water law have not always been done in good faith. They have been done in order to legitimize taking water from existing users and the environment so powerful and entrenched interests can access it without consequence. Water banking, water marketing, monitoring, management, mitigation all sound like swell ideas, but as we know, the devil is in the details. What lawmakers sometimes get is a presentation that certain proposals are silver bullets that will solve all of our problems. But really, some of the past legislative attempts to change water law have been contrived efforts to consolidate water, money, and power among a select few interests. However, when we focus on community-based efforts like the useless turf bill last session, we set a national and global example. I believe there is hope. And I think the best thing that we can do for the state is to ensure that the Division of Water Resources has the financial means to do the job that is already outlined in the statutes and regulations. The current team at DWR inherited the problems we all face in many cases, and with more financial tools at their disposal, they will have the ability to help fix some of the problems. As it relates to our urban areas, what is the margin of error? What are the limitations? Paper water does not make wet water. Look at the Colorado River, Humboldt River, Walker River, Carson River, and Truckee River to some extent. The signs of change are everywhere. You can show reports and make promises about the future, but Mother Nature is the only one who holds the answers. Do not be fooled into believing that the all growth is good growth model won't come without costs in the environment, ratepayers, and taxpayers in the future. Again, the decisions we all make for the Nevada of today will have ripple effects for the Nevada of tomorrow. Thank you so much. I look forward to working with you all.
Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Roerink. BPS, can we see if we have anyone else wishing to provide public comment?
Chair, the public line is open and working, but there are no more callers.
All right, thank you very much. With that, we'll move on to the next item on our agenda, which is the approval of the minutes for our February 28th meeting. Everybody should have the minutes in front of them. Are there any questions, concerns, or corrections from the committee? Hearing none, then I would accept a motion to approve the minutes.
Move to approve. Senator Goycochea.
Thank you. So we've got a motion from Assemblywoman Carlton, and then we've got a second from Senator Goycochea. Any discussion on the motion? All right. With that, I think we're going to use a roll call because we've got folks in so many different places. So can we please call a roll for the vote?
Senator Goycochea.
Yes.
Assemblyman Ellison. Assemblywoman Hanson.
Yes.
Senator Doñate.
Yes.
Senator Scheibel. Assemblywoman Carlton.
Yes.
Assemblywoman Bilberry Axelrod.
Abstain.
Chair Watts.
Yes. Thank you. With that, the motion passes. Next on our agenda, we have a presentation on water issues in Southern Nevada. We'll be getting a presentation from the Southern Nevada Water Authority Welcome, Mr. Ensminger and Ms. Pellegrino. Glad to have you here. You can go ahead and proceed whenever you're ready by introducing yourself for the record.
Thank you, Chair Watts. John Ensminger, General Manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. For the record, with me today is SNWA's Deputy General Manager for Resources, Colby Pellegrino. I'm just going to go ahead and launch right into our presentation, but please, any member of the committee that has questions along the way, I'm happy to answer as we go. I think most members of the committee are familiar with where Southern Nevada gets the bulk of our water. We get 90% of our water from the Colorado River, and with that serve approximately 76% of the state's population. How we use water in Southern Nevada is very important because we only actually deplete water from the Colorado River system when we use water outdoors for lawns, pools, water features. There are thousands of septic systems in the valley that consumptively use water, and then evaporative cooling. Together, those three uses comprise the known universe of what we can do in conservation in order to lower our overall water demands, because indoor use simply doesn't matter for our overall water resource picture. Flows on the Colorado River. This shows the 21st century to date, and you can see it's not a pretty picture. We do have 5 years out of 22 over average, but 2002 was the driest year in recorded history. 2012 and 2013 were the driest back-to-back years in recorded history, right up until 2020 and 2021, which have now supplanted 12 and 13 as the driest back-to-back years in recorded history. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, these three pictures are probably worth several thousand words, because that really shows where we've come to in the 21st century, going from almost completely full. When Lake Mead is completely full, the surface sits at 1,220 feet above sea level. Today at 34% full, we're at about 1064, and the bad news is we can expect to fall into the 1050s or possibly even the 1040s this year by this summer. These are the probabilities produced by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and you see that the minimum probable is actually the 10th percent hydrology. So while that's very bad and shows the possibility of going below 1025 as early as next year, that's not a worst case scenario. You still have 9% chance that it will be even worse than that. All of that led the federal government to declare the first ever water shortage on the Colorado River. They did that in August. That garnered an enormous amount of national and international press. But I do think we should briefly explain shortage, because shortage is a legal term. When people hear shortage, they think we're out of water today, or there's going to be water rationing, today. But legally, what it means is your legal entitlement to Colorado River is reduced, not the amount of water you're actually using. So Nevada has a legal entitlement to 300,000 acre feet of water. But between 1050 and 1075, that's reduced by 21,000 acre feet. So our legal entitlement this year is 279. Last year we used 242. So a shortage for Southern Nevada means we have less extra water this year, which doesn't mean it should be taken lightly, but it's also not a crisis for us in the way it might be for some other water users. The second side of the problem, the first side of the problem is our 90% of our water supply is coming from an imperiled source. The second part of our challenge is there's a lot of people moving to Southern Nevada. This shows new accounts over the last, I think, 2016 through 2021. This is just for the service territory of the Las Vegas Valley Water District. So this is for City of Las Vegas and unincorporated Clark County. It doesn't include North Las Vegas and Henderson. So you see just for the Las Vegas Valley Water District, we had over 9,300 new connections in 2021, well above the recent past and in excess of anything we've seen since before the recession. The other half of this, though, is that Henderson and North Las Vegas combined also had over 9,000 connections. So we had over 18,000 new connections in the Las Vegas Valley just in 2021. This slide is directly from our 50-year resource plan that our board of directors approved in December of last year. We have now taken the step, previous resource plans, our climate change scenario projected an annual flow into the river of 12.9 million acre feet. For context, if you add up the compact, the treaty with Mexico, system losses, there's 17.5 million acre feet in legal rights to the Colorado River. And before this year, we were using 12.9 as our worst case scenario. Given what we've seen hydrologically over the last 2 years, we decided that wasn't bad enough to assume for a worst case scenario. We talked to a number of leading climate scientists in the basin and settled on using an 11 million acre foot hydrology. So if you forecast that over the next 50 years, you see Lake Mead quickly plummets even further than it has to date. And then we basically spend the next 50 years bouncing around between elevation 900 and 950. Those flat parts in the graph that you see beginning in the early 2040s and then for quite a stretch in the 2040s and 2050s, that's dead pool. That's the only reason the lake stays at 900 is because the Bureau of Reclamation cannot physically release water downstream to California, Arizona, and the country of Mexico. The third side of our problem, I approach this as we have three problems. Our water supply is imperiled. Our economy is growing very, very quickly, which isn't necessarily a problem, but for a water planner, accommodating that growth is a challenge. And then we have what to date has been, in my opinion, the most successful urban water conservation program in the world. But you see our GPCD over the last 4 or 5 years has really stagnated. So we haven't continued on the trajectory we need to stay on in order to accommodate everything that's going on. And then on the right side, you see what we project in terms of an increase in gallons per capita per day solely from increased local temperatures. We expect our GPCD to go up by 9 gallons per person per day by 2035 just because it's getting warmer locally. And we saw this in November where we had a huge response to November 1, everybody's supposed to go to 1 day a week watering. And in large part they did. But it was so warm in November that by the middle of November, we could see that a big chunk of our customers had gone back to watering 3 days a week. So this increase in gallons per capita per day because of warmer temperatures is real and it's measurable. So the good news is despite our population increasing by over 850,000 new residents since 2002. We have reduced our overall consumption of Colorado River water by 26%. That's fantastic. I'm unaware of any community anywhere that can, show those types of numbers. But the bad news is we've done the easy stuff, and we essentially need to do this again over the next 15 to 20 years in order to accommodate the economic diversification that the community wants to have. So I'm not going to go through every single one of our conservation goals. I'll kind of summarize them at the end, but basically you just need to know we're doing everything we can possibly think of to drive down demands. That starts, as this committee is well aware of, with AB 356, which I think is the first of its kind that I'm aware of anywhere in the world of a community taking the step of saying, we don't have the luxury to invest our precious water resources in non-functional turf that only gets walked on when somebody mows it. So that bill was passed, signed by the governor. Our board approved the definitions of non-functional turf that were approved by the Citizens Committee in January. So we're off and running, and there's some big projects going on right now in the community as people begin to comply with this new law. However, getting the bad stuff out is one step. Stopping the bleeding is another step. So we're now taking the step at the local level to prohibit installation of new turf anywhere except in schools and parks and cemeteries. Evaporative cooling, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have heard some about this. The business community is, I think, legitimately concerned with some of the costs that would be associated with construction and operation. But again, the known universe of what we can do to conserve water is only three things. And having more efficient cooling systems in our new construction is imperative as we move forward. Assemblywoman Carlton, did you have a question? Okay. So we are working with the business community. None of this is final yet. We're trying very hard to come up with a solution that will work for the development community as well as for our water resources. We have local funding that helps offset the conversion of existing systems. So I believe we're going to get there. It's just not something we can flick on a switch and have it happen overnight. So I think I'm down to my last two slides, and basically what this shows is this, again, directly from our resource plan, and this quantifies every conservation action that we can think of. It translates that into savings in gallons per capita per day. It shows us going from 112 up to that 123 because of climate change and system aging, and then from 123 stepping us down to 86 gallons per capita per day if we can implement every one of these hard things. But for every hard thing we don't want to do, that will at some point have an impact on our ability to continue economic diversification. So again, last slide here, this is directly from our resource plan. And what this shows, the dark blue is our permanent Colorado River supplies. The light blue is 25,000 acre feet from our partnership with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. The green is our temporary bank supplies. And when the brown creeps in, that's where we would need new supplies that aren't currently within our resource plan. So you see in the first two, if we hit that 86 gallons per capita per day by 2035 in our lower growth scenario, we don't need any new supplies. We don't even tap into our temporary supplies. In our upper demand scenario, where we inflate even over the population currently projected by CBER, you see us beginning to tap into our temporary supplies in the mid 2040s or so, but we don't need new supplies well into the late 2060s. But if we can only get to 98 or 92 gallons per capita per day, you see us accessing our bank supplies this decade and needing new water supplies much sooner. So again, everything we're trying to accomplish for water management in Southern Nevada is really driven by demand management and conservation. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you very much for the presentation. With that, we'll open it up to questions. We'll begin with Assemblywoman Carlton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I have a couple, if I may, and then we'll kind of go from there. So you were talking about 18,000 new connections in 21. So what was that overall impact, and where are we going to have to draw the line on new connections?
So here's...
I know
we showed
to
it the
start with a toughie
well,
here.
Well, no,
so.
It's we added, 18,000 new connections, and we used 14,000 acre feet less. Our usage in 2020 was 256,000 acre feet. We drove that down to 242 in 2021. So we're still showing, at least in a one-year snapshot, you're seeing us continue to be able to accommodate this economic diversification while at the same time use less water. But we're kind of on that razor's edge where we have to keep making those gains every year in order to be able to accommodate it. If we stop making gains in conservation, we won't be able to keep up.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess that's the point. I mean, you can only conserve to a certain level, and then it would be irresponsible to build something and not be able to hook it up. So, and we've had this conversation since the Ring Around the Valley conversation back in the mid-90s. So, going back to the septics, that's something, honestly, I had never really thought about. So what is that impact, and how many of them are there, and what does it take to convert it? Because with all those septics, we're losing all the return flow credits. So that money is basically, septics are outdoor use in a way because they just don't come back. So where are we with that?
Yeah, so, and just to put that into context, we estimate that a new home in 2022 that is hooked into the potable water system but is on a septic system versus a new home that's hooked into the sanitary sewer, the one on the septic uses about 6.5 times more water than the one that's hooked into the sanitary sewer. So our estimate, Colby may have a more precise number, but we think there's at least 15,000 existing homes and businesses, but mostly homes, that are hooked into the potable water system and are on a septic. And so do you have an idea how much water we would save if those could all be converted?
I can look it up.
Okay, well, it's over 10,000 acre feet. It's, probably, I think our estimate was about 12,000 acre feet. So, and to put that into context, our partnership with Metropolitan, we're going to get between 25 and 30,000 acre feet out of that at a cost of at least $750 million. So you do that math, yeah, 12,000 acre feet doesn't sound like a lot, but it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars to our community. So in terms of what it takes, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. There are neighborhoods in the valley where there's literally sewer in the street and dozens of homes are 30, 40 feet away from the sewer and they're still on septic. So there's some low-hanging fruit where you could go in and probably get some of those conversions with a relatively decent, bang for your buck. But then there's others where, the homes are 1,700 feet away from the sewer and there's all, custom 2-3 home lots, and it would be probably cost prohibitive to go after those. But as with the turf, the first front in the battle for us is stop the bleeding. So the Las Vegas Valley Water District has taken the step of saying we will not hook anyone into our retail water delivery system unless they also hook into the sanitary sewer. And there's been a very vocal minority that's not real happy about that, but we can't continue to devote 6.5 times the amount of water for those lots versus the others, or we're simply not going to be able to accommodate everyone.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I remember these exact same conversations that we had about domestic wells years ago, trying to deal with the well issue and moving forward from there. I guess my final question is, well, it's not, but I'll turn it over to the other members of the committee. So we've talked a lot about, the use and the levels. The thing that concerns me, and the thing that I started with the Water Authority on back in 1997, 98, was the quality of the water. So we're talking about the level, but when it hits dead pool, what is the actual quality of that water that will be delivered to people's homes? It can't be getting better.
Well, our biggest challenge, in terms of quality, like in terms of, any sorts of contaminants or things of that nature, we have some of the most advanced water treatment systems in the world. We both chlorinate and ozonate the water. We're going to continue to be able to meet all the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. That's not going to come into question. But operational challenges are going to be temperature, because as the lake falls, that top 30 feet of the lake is far warmer than the rest of it. We saw this before we brought our third intake online. We started seeing because we chlorinate, we have disinfection byproducts that as the water gets warmer, the formation of trihalomethanes accelerates. So we had to install aeration systems on all of our retail reservoirs. If you roll the water over, it prolongs the formation of those trihalomethanes. So the temperature will be something that we have to deal with, and turbidity, the amounts of solids per liter of water. You're essentially going from a nice, cold, deep lake operating a water system like the city of Chicago to going to a warm, tepid river with a water treatment like St. Louis. Right? So that water can be treated, but we're plumbed to do it one way, and we're going to have significant capital costs to be able to do it the other way.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next, we're going to go to Assemblyman Ellison, and then we'll go to Assemblywoman Bilbray Axelrod.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now? One of the questions I do
Yes, we
have
can.
is,
Go ahead.
and I do appreciate Maggie bringing them questions up because I had one of them, same thing. But I do like to know, I don't know much about swimming pools. We don't have a lot of them in Elko. Eureka or Ely or Winnemucca or rural Nevada don't have a lot of swimming pools floating around. How often do they change them? Do they have to change them once a year, the water, or do they do it just by chemicals? So have you considered these newer homes, allow them to build them but not fill them until this water table comes back up?
So in terms of changing the water, I believe it's recommended, every year, at least every 2 years, you want to empty your pool and acid wash it and, start with fresh water because it does harden over time. There is a existing law that requires the emptying of the pool to go into the sanitary sewer. You can't just run a hose out into the street and let it go down the gutter. So that water, when the pool is emptied, is recaptured, treated, put back into Lake Mead. We can take it back out. The loss from pools is the same, essentially as the loss from turf. It's the evaporation. We do incentivize pool covers, and one step that we are proposing, it hasn't been put into code yet, but we would like to see it put into all the local codes this year, is to limit new pool size construction to no more than 600 square feet. That's one of the things that's on that step down chart that we showed you guys. It's not a huge water savings, but we have seen some pretty, in my frank opinion, offensive construction in some of the luxury home markets where we've seen the installation of 4,000 and 5,000 square foot water features at private homes. So we do want to limit those, but we haven't gotten to the step where we're saying, you're not allowed to fill, you're not allowed to build, but we do think limiting the size is prudent at this point.
Thank you. And if I can do a follow-up, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Session before last, we actually had a bill into, I can't remember if it was a bill or if it was what they were doing at Lake Mead to drop that level of the conduits and drawing more out of the bottom versus where it was at mid-level. So did they ever finish that? They run that pipeline down through there. They were working on it for a long time. They showed quite a bit of digging down through there, how they were lowering the conduits that were going back into the city where they were pumping out of. It was lower because of the water temperatures. Did that ever get finished?
Thank you for that question, Assemblyman Ellison. First of all, I just want to make sure to remind everyone to please state their name for the record before proceeding. And I believe you're talking about the third intake. So if you could just give a brief update on kind of where we're at with our intakes and pumps.
Sure. So yeah, we finished the third intake, and it's been operational, and we've been pulling 100% of our water from it since 2015. Again, because we wanted to access that colder water from deeper in the lake. But then in early 2020, we also brought online the low lake level pumping station. So in combination, the third intake and the low lake level pumping station are right at $1.5 billion in local capital investments. We built those capital facilities without any money from the state or the federal government. And fortunately, now that we have those facilities online, that really gives us the most secure water delivery system in the desert Southwest, because our intake is located at elevation 860. The dead pool that I showed you guys is right about elevation 900. So under any hydrologic condition, we're pretty much guaranteed to have 40 feet of water over our intakes. And that's at an elevation where you saw, places like Phoenix and Los Angeles and Sonora and Baja can no longer access water from the Colorado River. So as concerning as everything I showed you is, our physical ability to pump water is not in question, which is a real benefit, obviously, for our community.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it just shows the importance of some of these investments in resilient infrastructure. Things have taken a turn for the worse on the Colorado River system relatively quickly, and it's good that we are not scrambling to make sure that our infrastructure can adapt to those changes. So with that, we'll take questions from Assemblywoman Bilbray Axelrod.
Thank you, Chair Watts, and thank you for being here. Just a historical fact, I served on natural research, actually it was called NatRam at the time last session, and served as vice chair. So this is, I love this subject. I love talking about this subject, and I'm glad you're here, so thank you. I also want to say I was a child in 1983 when Lake Mead was actually overflowing and the spillways were going over, and we watched the carp going over the side. So it's just so crazy to think in that amount of time. I don't feel that old, but to go from there to here. I had a question. I know that we have the 300,000 acre feet and we get kind of the first right. How are you working with California and Arizona? Are they recognizing that we have done these great things like reclaim our indoor water and the other things that you do? Are they recognizing that those are best practices, and are you having dialogues with them? Because I don't know if this is true, but I know it was that California was overusing what they were allowed to have. So I don't know if that still stands, but it's like, I sort of feel like, once again, Las Vegas, Southern Nevada, we're leading the way, but we really have a very small percentage of Lake Mead. And so I'm just wondering if those sort of best practices are being shared and embraced.
Well, there are certainly...
And sorry, could you introduce yourself for the record, Mr. Enstminger?
Oh, I'm sorry, John Enstminger, for the record. There are certainly communities that are beginning to follow our lead. The Colorado legislature just passed a bill, not as aggressive as our AB 356, but in their legislative record, definitely citing to our example and copying, our stuff going forward. So there are communities beginning to view turf very much like we view it. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. I would say in California, the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, which has 19 million customers from Santa Barbara to San Diego, they're doing some pretty amazing things. They are investing heavily in conservation. They're our partner on the regional recycling program that's going to take all of the wastewater that's currently being discharged into the Pacific Ocean, treat it, inject it into their aquifers in Southern California, and generate up to 130,000 acre feet of new water supply that we're investing in, so they'll leave a portion of their water in Lake Mead for our use. But there are, irrigation districts in California that aren't doing a whole lot. They have the senior rights on the river, and thus far seem to feel relatively bulletproof and haven't taken a lot of steps. Arizona's taken huge hits because they, in 1968, in order to get congressional funding for the Central Arizona project, they agreed to take California's share of shortages. So they're taking hundreds of thousands of acre feet in shortages. And unlike us, that doesn't mean they have less extra water. That means they actually have to cut existing uses. And you're seeing a lot of agriculture in Pinal County, not getting Colorado River water now and switching back over to groundwater. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Albuquerque is doing tremendous things in conservation. Denver, I mentioned Southern California, Las Vegas, but there's big parts of the basin that are still acting like they don't have a problem.
Thank you for that. And that actually, California obviously is a great big state with a lot of different politics, I guess I would say, kind of like ours. I did want to just say one thing, and I thank my colleague, Assemblywoman Carlton, for bringing up the septic tanks. I know not far out of my district is Section 10 and Section 11, which is roughly, Jones to Buffalo, DI to Sahara. They're all on septic, all of those homes, and I'm sure that the water comes right up basically to their house, but then they're on septic. So yeah, I'm very intrigued on that issue and look forward to having further conversations.
Absolutely. And I don't know if we've, quite gotten all of our thinking through, but that may well be something we want to discuss, during the next session. I would say specific to Section 10, Commissioner Jones just talked to me last week, and we're getting a PDF from him because I don't know exactly what's going on, but I think they're doing some rehabilitation of some of the water lines. Somebody's digging up the street for something. I'm not sure exactly what, but it's an awesome opportunity to get in there and do a big chunk of conversions from septic to sewer connections, while the street's already torn up. So we're working with Commissioner Jones on that.
Thank you. Members, any other questions?
Mr. Chair.
Senator Goicoechea.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Goicoechea for the record. Mr. Ensinger, John, can you tell me what the average water bill is in that you service there in Clark County?
The median, because we generally take out the highest 10% and the lowest 10% and use the median of the middle 80%. And that bill today is right about $55, which puts us at right at the 50th percentile for water bills in the 63 city Western Index.
All right, thank you. I'm just curious. We always hear about that a little bit, and I just wanted to weigh that out again. I know some rural areas, but again, we don't have the conservation and as well as the return flow credits that you guys do. You're doing a great job with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, additional questions?
Chair, it's Assemblywoman
Yes,
Hanson.
Assemblywoman Hanson, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. I had a question as well on septic tanks. I was surprised to hear that septics use 6 times more water, and was just curious, does the process for septic tanks for approval in new construction, if they're doing that much, does that approval come through the county, or I'm assuming some have been grandfathered in certain locations? I'm just curious how we're monitoring whether those are being installed in newer construction, or is that kind of behind us?
So unfortunately, it's not behind us. It's driven, at least in Clark County, it's driven through the Southern Nevada Health District. They're the ones that can permit septics, and grant a waiver from even the existing conditions, because you're supposed to be a certain distance from sewer in order to get one, but because of the cost, historically, the waivers have been granted pretty regularly. So we've addressed the issue for 70% of the retail, because the Las Vegas Valley Water District has now put into our service rules that we won't connect to the potable water system unless you hook into the sewer. But for the other 30% of retail in Henderson and North Las Vegas, there are septics hooking into Colorado River water today.
If I could, Chair, follow up.
Go ahead.
So is the health department in on these are they being made aware of the demand that the water usage is higher in that regard? Are they in the conversation at all as we address some of these concerns? And then if I could, I'll just piggyback with one other question. And aren't there more, I know there's some new technology with leach fields for septic tanks. Are we seeing any better conservation with those? Septic tank users do know that using too much water in their homes impacts negatively their systems. And so I would think there's almost an kind of a built-in motivation to conserve water in your home, because it's a drain, it's a large demand on the leach field. So the two questions then are there better technologies for septic tanks? I would say maybe for leach fields, the sand mounds is the first question. The second one being, are we, no, actually it's just that one question. Well, my head's spinning with the septic tank issue.
Well, I think your first one was how involved is the health district at this juncture, and they're very involved. Fortunately, Marilyn serves as the chair of the Water Authority, and she's also on the health district board, so she's been very instrumental in helping us get their attention. We made a presentation to their entire board 3 or 4 weeks ago, and really drove home the water quantity aspect of this. So we're working hard with them. Obviously, the health district has been, pushed to its limits with COVID and everything. It was a hard time to go in and ask them to devote a whole bunch of staff to enforcement of septic conversions, but I do think we're getting there with them. In terms of the new technologies, I'll look at Colby if she knows anything about it. I don't. We approach this from, everything that, hits a drain in every other home and business gets treated and put back into Lake Mead. For septics, it's lost. So we're kind of a single issue voter, except that I would also raise a water quality concern, in areas of the valley with a lot of septic systems. We've also seen a pretty sharp increase in nitrates in the groundwater table, to the point where we've actually stopped producing water for our customers from a couple of our big production wells in the center of the valley. So it's both water quantity and water quality that's being affected by allowing these systems to be installed.
And this is Colby Pellegrino for the record. Just to my knowledge, there's not any technology that helps conserve water, because there's no way to get that water back from the ground into the sewer system. There is obviously septic technology that's changed towards helping with the water quality issues John discussed. The problem that we see is most people don't maintain the denitrification systems that they're required to have by the health district. So not much that's actually translated into increased water savings or improved water quality on that front.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the input. And if I could, a crazy little random plug, visited the sewer treatment plant up here in the Reno-Sparks area and was absolutely amazed at the processes and the lengths that technology and the systems go to help us maximize and get our water clean. And so I just want to give them, and same in your districts, a little bit of a shout out that it's one of those unsung heroes. Nobody thinks about taking a field trip to a sewer plant, but I actually highly recommend it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. And yes, our wastewater treatment plant keeps the wetlands wet down here in southern Nevada. So one thing I just wanted to also kind of clarify on this issue is, and I think Assemblywoman Hansen was getting to this, is that there can be some significant regional differences, and particularly because of southern Nevada's location next to Lake Mead and its return flow credit system. This makes septic tank usage a particular issue for our water resources that may not apply in other areas of the state. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And anything, that we would want to discuss with you, we would want to be discussing on behalf of our service territory, not representing anything for the rest of the state.
Thank you. I think that's helpful to get on the record, and look forward to, I think there's a significant interest in continued discussion on this topic among the members of the committee. Members, are there any other
Could I have one
questions?
more question, Mr. Chair? Senator
Yes, you may,
Goycochea.
Senator, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Ensinger, has there been any thought given to the fact that it just piques my interest listening to the conversation here? So clearly, if you've got a connection that is going to a septic system, have you given any thought to maybe a tiered rate structure because they consumptively use more water? And it looks to me like that would, in fact, incentivize them to, okay, let's go ahead and hook up the sewer if it's going to cost you twice as much to get your water, if in fact you're using a septic versus a hookup, even if you're a developer, the long-term plans. Has there been any thought on that, a rate structure where the consumptive use actually increased the amount of the cost of water? At $55, why worry about it? But, if it was costing you $300 because you were going to a septic, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think you've been reading our mail because we've been having a lot of conversations exactly about that over the last, just 3-4 weeks. And, obviously my board hasn't, taken any action yet, but just some of the things that have been kicked around are, we have a tiered system or a tiered rate structure. So you could just charge anyone who's on a septic at the 4th tier and don't give them the first 3 tiers. You could have some sort of assessment on top of the existing tier structure just to do that, because we're really, philosophically, we take the position, we rent people water, right? You get to use it, but you have to give it back to us so that we can treat it and rent it to somebody else. We don't sell people water, and people that are on septics are, 100% consumptive uses. So having some sort of structure, not just to generate the revenue, but then to have that revenue hopefully to be converting people off of and providing some sort of incentive, very much like the groundwater management program, where if your well fails, we have monies to help you get hooked into the potable water system. So yes, generate more revenue from the septic owners, but use that to get them hooked into the sanitary sewer.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Members, additional questions? All right, Assemblywoman Carlton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it comes back around to, if we do want to get these folks off of septic, and there is a large cost to it, we've got to figure out how to be able to address that cost. Are there dollars available now, or have you been watching some of the other monies that are coming into the state? You mentioned the domestic well issue that we've had in the past and how we converted folks. That's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, you mentioned that Henderson and North Las Vegas don't seem to be taking this quite as seriously as other folks, but they're all drawing from the same lake. So how do we address entities that don't want to actually, you're saying you won't hook them up, but you're also telling me that those two entities aren't really doing much about it. So how do we make the pieces of this puzzle fit together?
I think they're getting there. We've had several conversations with both of those municipalities. We have a package of things that need to be put into code. And that includes, the ban on installation of turf anywhere except schools and parks. That includes the 600 square foot limitation on new swimming pools. That includes something on evaporative cooling. At least for the water district, it's going to have stuff to do with rates for high volume customers. So I think when that package gets put into city code, that's our opportunity to really press them on doing the same thing that we've done vis-a-vis allowing new septics to hook into the potable water system.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? Last call for questions. Well, I think members hit most of my questions as well, one of which was kind of talking about this the financial issue and how we, work out both rates and, to bring in revenue and invest in some of these additional conservation initiatives. So it sounds like there's already thinking around that. I think one of the other questions I had was the role for state policymakers, and I think towards Assemblywoman Carlton's question, there's a lot of conversation and collaboration happening with local governments, and I think we want to encourage that to happen. Of course, there are roles for the state to play, and we want to make sure that there's also conversations happening with the different stakeholders in the community, but state policy can come in where needed to set kind of some uniform policies, even on a county by county basis. And so I think that's something that we look forward to continuing to have a conversation about and explore areas where state policy may need to come into place. Are there any other policy issues that you want to make us aware of at the state level?
Before I answer that, I think I was remiss in not answering the first part of Assemblywoman Carlson's questions, and you brought up the cost. So we're having discussions at the water district level about what sort of district revenues can be brought to bear. I know Jim Gibson and Marilyn Kirkpatrick were having that same conversation with Clark County Reclamation District last week. So we're going to need to address this both from the water side and the wastewater side. And the third piece of this may well be, and I haven't seen the summary yet, but I know my staff was working on summarizing the EPA guidance for distributing the bipartisan infrastructure funding into the state revolving fund. Historically, SNWA, Las Vegas Valley Water District, haven't accessed very much out of the state revolving fund, except as it relates to, Laughlin and, Kyle Canyon, some of our outlying rural systems that we actually operate. We've used SRF funding for some of those. This may be a spot where, as a state policy issue, we really want to take a look at letting SNWA and or LVVWD access some of that SRF funding from the bipartisan bill to take on some of this septic stuff. In terms of other policy issues at the state level, I think we'll know a lot more before we get into session, see how this winter plays out, see where the Colorado is in terms of operations. You've given us tremendous support with AB 356. We'll have a year under our belt of implementing that, and we'll be able to, see if we need any, tweaks to that. But by and large, I think you've really given us the tools we need for the time being.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ensminger. I appreciate that. I'd just like to note for the committee's and public's awareness that we will be having a subcommittee on public lands meeting in Boulder City, I believe in May, where we'll also be discussing water-related issues, and I've asked the Water Authority to discuss some of the larger Colorado River Basin issues that I think also got brought up on this as well. So look forward to getting a little bit larger perspective on that at that time, kind of the status of negotiations and a larger basin-wide perspective, and figure out how we as a legislature can provide perspective from the state of Nevada on where the basin should be going. So with that, I think that covers everything that we have for today. Again, I thank you for the presentation. Look forward to continued discussion on how we continue to advance conservation and protect the water supply for Southern Nevada. So thank you both.
Thank you very much for having us.
All right. With that, we will move on to our next presentation, which will be on water issues in the Truckee Meadows and Northern Nevada. So we'll have the Truckee Meadows Water Authority presenting. I think I can see that we've got our panel in Carson City ready to begin. So Please go ahead whenever you're ready and introduce yourself for the record, and you can proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. John Zimmerman, Assistant General Manager for the Truckee Meadows Water Authority. And with me, I have Steph Morris, who is Tumwas Water Resources Manager. So first, I want to thank the committee for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to present on Tumwa and the Northern Nevada water resource issues. So just an overview of the Truckee Meadows Water Authority. So it is a joint powers authority. It was created in 2001 by the cities of Reno and Sparks in Washoe County. The water utility prior to that was owned by Sierra Pacific Power Company. And so when Sierra Pacific, now NV Energy, offered to sell or notified the community that it was going to sell its water utility, the community stepped up and created Tumwa to manage those assets. So we're governed by a 7-member board of elected officials from Reno, Sparks, and Washoe County. And you'll see in that first or second slide, one of the significant mergers we've had in the last few years was merging with Washoe County.
I apologize for interrupting you, sir, but we don't have the, now we've got it, I think, up on our screen, so we can see the slides now. Sorry. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. So in 2015, we merged with Washoe County and a large general improvement district in southern Truckee Meadows. And so that was a large investment, and it really shows that the benefits of regional water resource management, because Washoe County and Stimgid were heavily reliant on groundwater. And when Tumwa took over the system, we were able to supply a lot of those areas with surface water, which rested the groundwater wells, and those aquifers recovered. This next slide is just an overview of Tumwa's service area. So we have 2 main Truckee River surface water treatment plants. The Chalk Bluff treatment plant is our newest and provides water throughout the year. The Glendale treatment plant is in the center of the valley. It's an older plant, and we use that plant to provide water during summer peaking, and so it's shut down in the winter months. And then you can also see, which unique to Tumwa's system, we have 3 operating run-of-river hydroelectric facilities. These have been around since the early 1900s, and they provide a significant amount of revenue to the utility, which lowers our customers' rates. And then not pictured on this map is a water treatment facility off of a creek in southern Truckee Meadows. And that creek treatment water plant, once it becomes operational in a few months, that'll allow those groundwater wells to be rested even farther, and we'll use that creek water to supply water demand for our customers in the summer, and then also use it for aquifer storage and recharge in the shoulder months in the winter. So just a little bit about the population Tumwa serves. So our total retail population is 430,000 people. We have 1 large wholesale customer, that's the Sun Valley General Improvement District. Our current demand is 83,000 acre feet. That's 80% of that is supplied by the Truckee River, and then about 20% is groundwater. With Tumwa, we have the ability to rely on conjunctive management of our water resources. So when surface water is, when we have a normal or above average year on the Truckee River, we're allowed to rely on that and generate most of our water supply through that. And then in the peak of the summer, we can rely on our groundwater pumping to meet our customers' demands. And then in a drought, we can rely on more groundwater pumping because we've rested the aquifer, so there's water there that we can use. And then we also have our upstream storage reservoirs. And again, our 3 hydroelectric plants, it's about 3.5 million, so that equals about a 3% reduction on average on our customers' bills, so it's a significant investment. This next slide shows the sources of our water supply. So obviously the Truckee River, we have 2 water rights that were decreed to the municipality when the Truckee River decree was entered. That's our so-called 40 CFS right and our Hunter Creek right. So those 2 water rights on the Truckee River were very senior priority water rights, and we used those up until the 1960s to create a water supply. And then in the 1960s, when new growth was happening, developers started to convert decreed agricultural rights to municipal supply. So through the state engineers process, those agricultural rights were converted to be able to be used for municipal purposes. We also have 2 what we call privately owned storage reservoirs in Independence and Donner Lake. That's 27,000 acre feet. And then with the Truckee River operating agreement, which I'll get to in a little bit later, we can store much more in the federally operated reservoirs, Lake Tahoe, Boca, Prosser, and Stampede. And then we also have our groundwater supply. And within the Truckee Meadows, we have a bit of a unique operating order with the state engineer. In non-drought years, like I said, we don't rely on groundwater that heavily. We store it. We also recharge treated surface water, and that increases our groundwater bank within the Truckee Meadows. And then in drought years, we can rely on that storage to meet our customers' demands. This next slide just shows a pie chart, and it kind of hits on how the Truckee River Operating Agreement was allowed to come to fruition, because you'll see that in normal years, Tumwa uses about 3% net from the Truckee River, so a very small portion. And a large majority of the Truckee River water in a non-drought year goes to the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. That's the PLPT on the graph. And then TCID is the irrigator, Truckee Carson Irrigation District, the Fernley and Fallon farmers. They also take that water in a normal year. And then in a dry year, Tum was allowed to take a little more. The Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe takes less. And so that was really what allowed the Truckee River Operating Agreement to be compromised, because between Tumwa, and again, TROA involves the United States, the state of California, state of Nevada, Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, and Tumwa. But between Tumwa and the tribe, at one point during TROA negotiations, both parties discovered that, well, TROA needs water in a drought. And so we need to rely on upstream storage to be able to meet the demands of our customers. And then in a non-drought, we don't need all of the water that we're entitled to under the decree, so we can let that go. And so that's where TROA really was a pretty good compromise between the lower users and the upstream users. This next slide just shows a quick overview of the Truckee River system. Obviously, Lake Tahoe, the largest storage reservoir on the system. Then you have Donner and Independence, our privately owned stored water lakes, and then also Prosser, Stampede, and Boca. So under TROA, the water year starts in October. That's when all the TROA parties start to establish credit water and upstream reservoirs. And then as the water year proceeds, if it's going to be a good water year, all of that water that Tumwa has stored turns over to what's called fish credit water. So it either spills and goes downstream in the Truckee River system, or it converts to fish credit water, and that is controlled by the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, and they can store it for future use or allow it to be spilled in that year. And so TROA really provides operational flexibility, allowing us to use that stored water when we need to. Under TROA, the river model, after 30 years of negotiations, the river model and all the TROA parties came up with the estimate that TROA would be able to meet a municipal demand for Tumwa of 119,000 acre feet. So again, right now, our current demands are 83,000 acre feet, and so our current water resource plan shows that we can meet the demands of our future population growth for the next 20 years. Obviously, we update that every 5 years, and there are certain challenges we're going to have to face, but right now, our water resource plan shows that we can meet those demands for the next 20 years. Just to touch on a little bit, the Truckee River system is different than most systems. Obviously, every system is unique, and it's different than the Colorado River system. We are not in the middle of a 20-year drought. We had our highest water year on record in 2017, and then also another above average year in 2019. And so it's really this ebb and flow for us of drought years, non-drought years, but with our upstream storage reservoirs. And I can't emphasize enough, but with the benefit of TROA, it really gives us the ability to meet our customers' water demands. The other thing I wanted to point out is with TROA and with the Truckee River Decree, there are certain return flow obligations to the Truckee River. So in southern Nevada, they get credit for all the wastewater that goes back, all the treated wastewater going back to Lake Mead. But in the Truckee River system, that water goes to the wastewater treatment plants and is discharged back into the Truckee River to meet the downstream water right holders who are in priority. And so that's one of the big differences with the Truckee River and other rivers. And just to go in, this next slide talks about Florestan rates. Those are under the Truckee River Operating Agreement. That was the required rates of flow at the California-Nevada state line. So in the summer months, it's 500 cubic feet per second, and then in the winter, it goes down to 400. That's made up of natural flow, water coming out of Lake Tahoe and Boca. And then we also have, I've already touched upon, our privately owned stored water in Donner and Independence Lake. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Morris. Well, actually, sorry, 2 more slides. Jumped the gun. So I just wanted to show you these 2 graphs. This is in 2015, which was our lowest water year on record, and we have over 100 years of water records. It just shows you that Florestan rates ran out in about June of that year, and we had to start relying more heavily on groundwater pumping, also our stored water out of Donner and Independence, and then our TROA storage reservoirs, Boca, Stampede, and Prosser. So that's what it looks like in a abnormally dry year. And then you can see once we get into the winter months, we can start relying just on our surface water again with a little bit of groundwater pumping to meet our water supply. And then in 2020, this was more of a normal year. You can see we rely heavily on Truckee River diversions throughout the year. We peak in the summer with our groundwater wells. And then as you go back into the winter months, we reduce our demands. So with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Morris just to talk about Tumwas planning efforts and then open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephanie Morris, Water Resources Manager for the record. I want to talk a little bit about some exciting things that we're doing and how we're planning for the future. So we do a water resources plan. Can you go to the next slide? Thanks. We do a water resources plan for 20 years, and it's very informative. This last one that we did in 2020 goes through 2040. It's much more user-friendly. If you have a chance to look at it, I encourage you to do so. I want to focus a little bit on climate change in particular, because that's what we were using and looking at it even beyond 20 years to see how we may plan for the future. And as you all know, models are always wrong, but also very informative. And so I'll talk a little bit about the modeling and how we are using that modeling to sort of plan for the future and what it looks like in our water resources plan. So there's a lot of information, and this is just really a cone, right? And at this side is what we know now, and as we get further away in the future, there's less that we know. But that doesn't mean that we don't plan and we don't look at scenarios for how we will deal with the future. It's like weather forecasting, 2 weeks in advance, it's better than it was 4 months earlier, and it's really accurate within 24 to 48 hours. So same thing, but on a longer time scale. Why we care so much about climate change, in particular on our system, is we're heavily reliant on snowpack. So most of our reservoirs where we have drought storage are located in California, and they're highly dependent on snowpack. And so as temperatures warm, the way that the snow changes, the water equivalent in the snow changes, and how it runs off based on temperatures really impacts how we manage our system. So in this current plan, in the 2020 to 2040, we looked at some pretty kind of almost like stress testing the system. So we looked out all the way to 2098. So we actually looked 80 years out. And we used 3 different scenarios to sort of see what would happen on our system. The 3 that we used was one looking at a historical drought scenario where we took some of the worst droughts on record and made an ensemble. Then we looked at a moderate emission scenario, and we used actually 8 global circulation models, and we fed each of them in, and I'll talk about the results. And then we also did the same thing for a higher emission scenario. So when we were, we went out to 2098, so we looked at a hypothetical demand, which again, this is hypothetical because we don't control population or growth, of 140,000 acre feet necessary to meet our demands. So the overview essentially showed us that in the historical drought situation, we didn't have any shortages, we had a lot of storage, and we had upstream storage never drop below 40,000 acre feet. This, I think, really highlights the importance of what Mr. Zimmerman was talking about how critical TROA is for us to have those drought supplies upstream. Looking at the moderate scenario, we showed 10 years out of the 640, so you have to take 8 times the 80 year to get that there was a shortage of about 1.5%, and the first shortage occurred in 2083 at a demand level of about 120,000 acre feet. And in the more extreme scenario, we had 25 out of the 640-year simulation showed a shortage, and that was about 3.9%. And the first shortages occurred in 2069 at a demand level of about 113,000. I do want to say that because we did run each of these GCPs or global circulation models through, some of them showed that we didn't have any shortages and others did. And I think it just highlights that as climate change data becomes updated, we will continue to update our models and we'll continue to have hopefully more accurate information. So essentially, our climate change analysis that was really a stress case showed that we do, even though there's extreme variability in snowpack and upstream reservoir storage and runoff, that we're able to meet our demands. We have good drought reservoir reserves, and we're optimizing our allocations for, efficiently using our water rights in a portfolio, including groundwater and surface water, and integratively managing those. But that's not enough. We need to do more. So I want to talk about a couple of things that we have done and some studies that we're looking at to further prepare for these types of changes in our system. So I'll start with the projects on the right. I'm not going to hit all of them, but I do want to talk a little bit about advanced water metering infrastructure. We are going through and systematically replacing our meters. These smart meters help us with conservation. They help customers know on a real-time basis what they're using. It helps identify leaks instead of, wow, my water bill went up 3 months in a row. Something weird must be happening. This will allow them sort of real-time information to call us and have our technicians come out and do an audit of the system and identify what potential issues are occurring. Mr. Zimmerman talked a little bit about the Mount Rose water treatment plant, which is coming online in the next couple months. I want to talk a little bit more about regional effluent management because the way TROA is set up and those return flows are required to go back to the system, not for credit, but required to go back. It really creates some difficulty as a region in managing effluent. And so the One Water Nevada team, which includes a number of folks, and I won't even start to say them because I might miss somebody, but are looking at what are the best ways that we can manage our effluent. And how Truckee Meadows Water Authority comes into play is helping manage the water resources to help meet return flow requirements. And the A+ pilot project has been completed. I'm happy and proud to say that the first project coming from that A+ treatment plant, which is treating for potable use to be recharged into the groundwater and then later extracted potentially for use, is the American Flat project. And we have finished and been approved by the Bureau of Reclamation for our feasibility study. And that project is moving forward. Both the city of Reno and Tumwas have partnered in a cost share agreement, and we have obtained some federal funding for that project and are seeking more. It's roughly a $103 million project. It would create 2,000 acre feet of water that's drought proof, and it would help in the sort of Lemon Valley area with the discharges into Swan Lake to reduce those and to put them to use initially, and then to test and get the permit for A+ indirect potable reuse. So it's very exciting, and I'm happy to be working on that project. On planning and studies, I'll just hit on 3. There's so many things that are exciting. I could talk for hours, but the first one is upstream reservoir reoperation. Stampede is the largest upstream reservoir where we have drought storage, and that reservoir has certain flood rule curves, and those are based on older hydrology. So we are partnering with the Bureau of Reclamation and others to sort of study how we can real-time manage reservoirs in a way that's a little bit more predictive, so that we don't release a whole bunch of water and then we don't actually get the storm that was supposed to come in to fill it, so that we don't lose that important storage. So that's a really exciting project, and I'm hoping that will lead to more efficient water management in the future. Marlette Lake is something that Tom was interested in looking at. Right now, the state is running that system, and there are potential opportunities to use water when others who are interested in using Marlette water and have rights to it aren't using it. So Tom was interested in partnering with those entities and the state to use Marlette water when other people aren't needing it, and to help us meet some of these return flow management potentially to put it into the groundwater for storage and other ways to put that water to full beneficial use. And then finally, I want to talk about something that I think is all near to us given the recent changes and what we've seen in fire behavior and fuels reduction and watershed protection. So we are a little bit unique given that our upstream reservoirs are largely located on land that we do not own, that's largely owned by the United States Forest Service. And they are in heavily forested areas, and fires could have a very catastrophic impact, as we've seen in Colorado and other states, on water supply in terms of sedimenting in reservoirs and reducing storage and creating water quality issues. So Tumwas has been working with the U.S. Forest Service, with the Nature Conservancy, with the Truckee River Watershed Council, and with National Forest Foundation to look at sort of innovative ways that Tumwas can partner and help focus and prioritize projects and funding to protect that upstream reservoir. And I'm happy to say that our board last week approved $500,000 over the next 2 years for a fuels reduction project that's right above Stampede Reservoir and help close a funding gap on approximately $4 million project that would treat 2,900 acres of forest and help protect our water supply. So a lot of exciting things, and again, just because things look good in our planning doesn't mean that there isn't more that we are doing. Thank you for your time.
So with that, Mr. Chair, if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
All right, thank you very much. I believe we do have some questions. We'll start with Assemblywoman Carlton.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. So not quite as familiar with this one as I am Southern Nevada, so I just want to clarify a couple of things. So you were talking about the whole system that you have as far as storage goes. Those are all, that's not all one basin though. There are different basins involved in all of these storage components?
John Zimmerman, for the record, that's correct. There are two main hydrologic basins for surface water. So you have the Lake Tahoe Basin, and then you have the Truckee River Basin. And then when it comes to our groundwater rights, we have water rights in 9 different hydrographic basins.
So water is transferred amongst those different basins depending upon what the climate is and what the need is?
From the surface water side, that's correct. Every year, the TROA parties are exchanging or establishing credit water in those upstream storage reservoirs. It might be in Lake Tahoe or in the Truckee Basin. You have Stampede, Boca, Prosser, Donner, and Independence Lakes. And then as far as our groundwater resources, we use those conjunctively as necessary to meet the demands of our customers, as usually in the summertime for peaking purposes. We do have a few satellite systems that are not connected to our Truckee River system where they're completely reliant on groundwater.
And as far as Tahoe goes, that's actually by state, so we're talking about sharing it with California.
That's a good point, Assemblywoman Carlton. So under the Truckee River Operating Agreement, that established the percentage of rights between California and Nevada. So Nevada got 90% of the water storage from the groundwater basins, and then California had 10%.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make the point, Mr. Chairman, that interbasin transfers of water isn't the evil thing that most people like to portray it as. Thank you.
Oh, boy. Thank you. Members, additional questions?
Go ahead.
Chair, if I could please.
Assemblywoman Hanson, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman and Ms. Morris, for being here. Maybe it's because we have a plumbing business that I just find this so fascinating. But and I gave a hint because we went to a sewer treatment plant, and I truly was fascinated. Couple of things. Maybe if we could. I remember the first time I learned about TROA, and it was when I was first elected in 2018, and I was at a roundtable at Pyramid Lake with the Pyramid Paiute tribe and other stakeholders. And my district is at the bottom of a lot of the water basins. In fact, it's cost me a lot of sleepless nights. I have Pyramid, I have Pershing County, so the bottom of the Humboldt, and I used to have Walker until redistricting. So certainly water issues have been a huge concern for my constituency. But I've been so impressed to see how things are being handled. And so maybe for the edification of myself to remind me and others, could you give us just a little brief history of TROA, when it was established, how it kind of came to be, if that's not too big of an ask?
Sure, I'll do my best. So the TROA negotiations started more than 30 years ago. Harry Reid got the parties together and forced them to start negotiating. And so it took 30 years. Early on, they did what was called the Preliminary Settlement Agreement, which established some of the initial parameters for operating the river while the parties were negotiating. And then in 2008, TROA was signed by all the TROA parties. There were a few conditions that were conditions antecedent that had to go into effect before TROA was implemented. And then in 2015, TROA was in effect and implemented.
Thank you. And if I could, Chair, I just need to follow up with a couple more items.
Go ahead.
When was the last time that, when we looked at a normal year and versus a dry year, when was the last time that Pyramid got more of the majority when it was a normal year? What was the last time they got more of the flow?
I believe that would have been in 2019. So
Okay.
2017 was the largest water year on record. 2019 was an above average water year, so more water would have flowed to Pyramid Lake percentage-wise.
And it was quite extreme. I remember 2015 you mentioned. I remember seeing Governor Sandoval standing out at Washoe Lake, and it was almost gone. And then driving by Rye Patch in 2019, and it's up to the top. So yeah, that cyclical nature. And then I was thrilled to hear I was going to ask about Swan Lake, and I thought, do I dare put you guys on the spot? That being in my district. Thrilled to hear about the A+ pilot. You said 103 million will go not just to that, but just to trying to help us with using effluent water. Is that right?
Thank you, Steph Morris, for the record. The 103 million is the cost of that project on American Flat, and that project is upgrades to the treatment facility plus an A+, so further refined treatment. And so it would then reduce the amount of effluent treated effluent that's discharged into Swan Lake.
And when did this get approved or finally finalized?
So again, what the feasibility study that was approved by the Bureau of Reclamation was just last week. And there was an interlocal agreement between Tumwas and the city of Reno that was approved, I think in January and December of last year for the cost to move forward with that project. And so the engineering for that project has started and the contract has been awarded. And so that there are other things that we are doing and other additional dollars that would go towards the sort of regional treated effluent, but this is sort of like a building block, so to speak, of how we may be able to use that and other areas and maybe recharge larger areas for groundwater basin with the treated potable indirect use.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate all this good information.
Thank you. Members, additional questions?
Mr. Chair, if I may, Senator Goycochea.
Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I've just got one quick question. Now, the 80,000 acre-feet of ag water rights that were converted, okay, was there any, I call it a haircut, but was there any reduction in those numbers when they were converted from ag to M&I? Clearly, there would be a change in the consumptive use, with agriculture. Typically, it's used, spread, goes in the ground, or transevaporation. Was there any kind of a reduction when those 80,000 acre-feet were in fact converted to M&I?
Good question, Senator Goycochea. For the record, John Zimmerman. So the way it works with Tumwas is if a project is going to be sewered to the Truckee Meadows wastewater reclamation facility, which then discharges treated effluent to the Truckee River, there is no consumptive use reduction because that return flow goes through the sewer plant instead of through irrigated agriculture. If we have a project that is not sewered to the Truckee Meadows wastewater reclamation facility, then what we do is require the developer to dedicate an additional amount of water rights on top of their demand so that water can be left in the river to satisfy downstream users.
Thank you, sir. And again, I just have to say we did a better job in negotiating TROA and the decree on the Truckee than they did in Southern Nevada on the Colorado, but thank you.
Yes, and thank you to Senator Reed for spearheading some of that effort. Members, additional questions? All right. I do have a question, and really it's just putting a little bit of a finer point on something that you already brought up in your presentation. So, of course, we are hearing about kind of the different operating and hydrological conditions in different areas. And so, we just heard a lot down here, for example, about turf removal programs. And, so you discussed that you're looking long range at your water supply. And could you just, kind of elaborate on if you did turf conversions in the Truckee Meadows service territory, essentially that conserved water would not be able to expand your supply for your customers, but it would go to flows downriver. Is that correct?
Thank you, Chair Watts. John Zimmerman. That's correct. So the way we operate with our water conservation policy is that if we're able to store water upstream, and if we have upstream storage, we ask, and it's in a drought year, we ask our customers to conserve because we can conserve that drought storage upstream. But in a non-drought year, like a turf removal program, we wouldn't be able to store that water upstream, and we don't recommit conserved water to new growth. So the way it works within Tumwas system is when a developer comes into our service territory and wants water service, they have to dedicate water rights to meet their demand, and we won't serve them unless they give us those water rights to meet that demand. And I think from a turf removal perspective, we also have to look back at customers on our system. We've been metered since the early 80s. With each passing drought, that drought messaging has an effect on our customers' water use. So over time, our customers slowly reduce their water use. We've had kind of toilet retrofit programs. And I think also you're seeing developers coming into the area, and because they have to dedicate water rights, and that's expensive, they want to reduce their water use too. So they're building residential developments that use less water. They're having HOAs control front lawns so that you have one landscape company that controls the irrigation of that front lawn and can reduce the water usage in that manner. And in fact, we've reduced our dedication requirement because we're seeing that reduction in water demand for new development.
It's Steph Morris, for the record, if I could just add on. Since 2000, it doesn't mean we're not conserving. We actually were conserving. The preliminary settlement agreement before TROA had a number of conservation measurements in it. So we've been conserving very early on. And since the 2000s, our population has grown by 30%, and our water use has reduced by 30%. So we are doing conservation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I'm glad that you clarified that for the record, because it's not my intention to make it sound like there's not conservation going on, but I think to help educate our members and the public that the conservation initiatives can look different in different places, and particularly from the perspective of you as a water provider to the community, some of the incentives change based on the system. And so it's not to say that even turf reduction is not a valuable thing. You discussed how some of the new development is adapting to that, but essentially it provides more of a downstream benefit than it does to the long-term supply for your customer base. So I just thought it'd be helpful to get some clarification on that on the record, and appreciate all the conservation initiatives that Tumwas has been undertaking. Members, additional questions for our panel? All right. Seeing none, I think that concludes our questions. So thank you very much to you both for your presentation today, and I think it was very helpful for us to get a perspective on the two major water distribution systems in our state, and appreciate your time today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman and Ms. Morris, for your time. With that, we'll move on to the next item on our agenda, which will be a presentation on water issues in the state, in the remainder of the state. So I believe we have the Division of Water Resources will be joining us to provide that presentation. So I know we have folks getting prepared, so go ahead and take all the time that you need, but I believe we have Administrator Sullivan and Deputy Administrator Fairbank joining us. So once you are settled, you can introduce yourselves for the record and begin your presentation.
Thank you, Chair Watts. Good morning, members of the committee. Thanks for having us. I'm Adam Sullivan, Nevada State Engineer, Administrator of the Nevada Division of Water Resources, and with me is Micheline Fairbank, Deputy Administrator for the division. So I'll be taking more of a statewide perspective on current issues and future challenges as we see it. A lot of the conservation tools that the municipalities have been able to implement, which are all really excellent, we've been hearing about this morning, are not necessarily available to a lot of the state, a lot of the water users, and that's an important perspective as I see it going forward. The current drought really is such a highlight that really brings forward the complexities and the constraints that are faced by water users statewide, and in managing this very limited water supply with increasing demands. We are the driest state in the nation. We've heard this before, but it's worth repeating, and one of the most fastest growing states in the nation. All the big themes that we talk about for moving forward in a smart way rely on dependable water resources. Whether it's economic issues, environmental protection, public health and safety, effective and realistic water management is essential. And none of these things happen without water security. Now, this is one way of demonstrating where we stand now. And what it points out is that we're already fairly water limited across most of the state. The darker colors here and the hatching represents a deficit in the long-term ability to meet all commitments. Now, it's really important to note here that this is an oversimplification. Some areas have much more acute water issues. Some areas, of course, have really effective water management plans in place, but it's helpful as a visual geographically. There's also a real range or a variety of reasons of how we got here, and it goes back decades. It's nothing new. The systems have resilience, so there hasn't always been a great urgency to address it, but the longer we wait, the more difficult and the more expensive it gets, particularly with increasing demands and more intense drought or water stress. So the framework, of course, that we work under and that defines what our water management options are for moving forward is provided in Nevada water law. Our agency is responsible for implementing sound policy in accordance with the water law and the best available science. But more immediately, the focus of our agency is on meeting the day-to-day needs of serving the public, of meeting statutory deadlines, and in keeping up with the workload that's right in front of us. For water rights, we process in the ballpark of 1,000 water right applications each year, and almost all of these are changes of existing rights. And although there's a fairly basic standard of review to not conflict with other users, each of these change applications really requires extensive consideration depending on the history or the location. And we have an excellent staff who really knows how to do this effectively, and this is critical for protecting both those water right holders that are who changing applications, as well as other users within the area that might be affected by that. Another statistic is that we process about 6,000 extensions of time per year, and these are extensions of time filed by water right holders to prevent losing a water right if they don't use it. Now, as time goes by, the demands and the complexities of these procedures and of the different issues continually seem to be increasing, and our division's capacity to serve the public becomes limited. Okay, so this demonstrates some of the examples of the complex water management issues that we're facing today and will continue to get worse if we don't get ahead of it. Hydrologic connectivity between surface water and groundwater. I'm going to explain each one of these because I know it's hard to grasp exactly what I'm talking about here. Generally, what I'm talking about are where wells are pumping in the vicinity of a river. So over time, pumping wells in the vicinity of a river can have an effect on reducing the flow in that river, and the river water generally has the senior water rights, but at the same time, that groundwater pumping might be supplying the local drinking water supply or other essential needs, and it might be really difficult to quantify or actually measure to what extent and where pumping might be related to a flow in a river and be able to have a assured metric of that. So addressing this issue is generally what we refer to with conjunctive management, and there's a distinction between that and conjunctive use that Mr. Zimmerman was talking about, but conjunctive management is where we're talking about these issues of groundwater and surface water that are connected. So secondly, chronic decline in local groundwater levels, and this happens when there's too many wells pumping in a concentrated area. And in a number of places around the state, we have a foot or two of aquifer drawdown each year, and with limited rebound in the wet years. So the question is, how much drawdown is too much? There is a lot of resilience in the system. Wells can still get the water. You can drill deeper, but at what point do you need to be taking a different tactic there? Third, assertions of conflict. And here I'm talking about where one user feels that their use is being inhibited by the use of others that may be junior. And again, this can be really hard to quantify, and it can be hard to demonstrate what's actually happening in a complicated aquifer system. Related to this, competing interpretations of hydrologic science. And here, where there's limited data, the same set of information can be used to draw different conclusions, to support different points of view, which makes things challenging. And to my last point, despite following the law and using the best available science as we have it available to us, our decisions are often appealed. And often for opposite reasons. We're not doing enough, or we're not doing too much. And this represents a significant demand on our staff and our office. Now, all these issues can be, and generally are, very site-specific, which additionally makes it hard to be responsive and address this, especially when we're really focused on meeting our day-to-day duties. The common theme among the complex issues is that there's not enough water to meet all needs in the long term. It's often recognized that Nevada water law is really, really good, and it has a lot of history behind it and has worked well for us for so many decades, and that is absolutely true for the appropriation and reallocation of water law, or of water rights. However, there are limited statutory tools to address water shortage. And I made the note here that the use of the term water shortage, as I'm saying, it has a different sense than the specific definition that Mr. Ensminger gave in working within a municipal system. I'm just talking about long-term not having enough. It's also worth mentioning, again, that municipalities have great options and have done so to really implement conservation measures that are effective within their system. And this is something that, as the sole provider with a customer base, it just enables a lot more flexibility in how that can be implemented, and that's just not available in every area where each user has their own water right. It sets it up for a different set of options or limitations in being responsive. So 3 things here. The first, administrative cancellation, forfeiture, and abandonment of water rights. And really this is related to the issue of extensions of time and approving or not approving those. And this is these are all very important tools for reducing commitments where water is not being used. However, it has to be done very carefully and with a lot of documentation, because obviously the impacts on those holders of those water rights is very significant. It needs to be done because it protects those users in the area that are in fact using water. Secondly, curtailment by priority. This seems simple, especially within a prior appropriation system, that if there's not enough, then the seniors get water, the juniors do not. However, it can have or would have very severe and in some cases ineffective outcomes, depending on the setting. It's often discussed. It's been proposed and held up in court, but it's never been implemented on a large scale, at a basin scale or a larger system. And that's similar to other Western states. There's a few cases where this has been carried out, but it's not typically a management tool. And then last, designation of critical management areas. In 2011, this was added into state law, giving or allowing a community to develop a groundwater management plan as a way of getting back into balance. And there's one groundwater basin in the state, Diamond Valley near Eureka, where this has been implemented, and it's been appealed, and we're currently awaiting a ruling on the Supreme Court. So here, the legislative intent was really good. We're creating an alternative path that would work best for the community affected. But the limitations here are really being tested, and depending on what comes out of the Supreme Court decision, we'll set a course or give an example of what we might be able to do in other places in similar situations. In the meantime, the community in Diamond Valley is somewhat in limbo, and I have many good things to say about the individuals there that have worked on this plan and have sort of struggled through a very difficult process. So looking forward, these are areas that I'd like to point out where there's not much directive in state law, but there is a need or a demand to address it. The challenge here is that we need to be able to implement or apply state water law consistently everywhere, but we'll also be able to acknowledge local conditions. So incentivizing water conservation, particularly for irrigation uses. Application of conjunctive management principles. Here again, this is the connection between surface water and groundwater. and clarity or guidance for adopting groundwater management plans, particularly as it relates to critical management areas. There's room to do this and approach this within existing law and within the prior appropriation system. But there's also some need for clarifying how that could be done. And by doing so, that would add certainty and defensibility to those who are affected by it. Regulations can be part of this, and an example of that would be AB 62 from 2019 that addressed extensions of time. And that's certainly something that we're exploring and talking about with stakeholder groups. But that also has to be done very carefully. And this is my closing slide with some summary comments on key needs for Nevada water resources. Water is foundational to our state's vitality. It needs to be a financial and policy priority. By doing so, we get ahead of some of these problems of limited supply and increasing demand. And the longer we go forward without addressing it head on, the harder it is. And that's, in a lot of ways, that's the current path that we're on. A key starting point here is to address critical funding needs for the Division of Water Resources. We're short-staffed, just like all state agencies and really across all sectors, but even when we're fully staffed up, it's a challenge just to keep up with our basic public services and maintaining and preserving our records, which leaves little room for addressing some of the more difficult long-term systemic risks that are facing us. So we have taken some steps to streamline and modernize our internal processes, which helps, and we have an amazing staff who've done great work with really limited resources to move this along, but there are some limitations there. So looking forward, I want to point to two areas of need that are important to prevent future problems. Updating the science on water resource availability is something that is right now is one of our priority asks with the federal funding availability through the ARPA opportunity. And here what I'm talking about is really using current accessible, proven methods that can just help us get a better understanding of the natural water budgets and what the long-term water availability is and what our water use is. Secondly, reinforcing Nevada water law. Changing law, of course, is very contentious and difficult and time-consuming, but there's opportunities, as I see it, to clarify the legislative intent. For instance, if we want to be really strict about non-use and cutting back based on this sort of strict interpretation of prior appropriation, that needs to be more clarified, I would say, in the law. And on the other hand, if we're more open to practical alternatives, that too could be clarified or reinforced. In all cases, it's critical to have, of course, a lot of public participation. We've been doing it as much as we can to communicate this with people who are potentially affected by this in the long run. But of course, it's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight, but it does need to be a priority. I thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm sure we have quite a few questions. I'll open it up to other members first.
Chair, if I could.
Yes, Assemblywoman Hanson, please proceed.
Thank you, and I appreciate it's a little bit of a challenge with some of us up here and some in South, so I appreciate you, Chair, letting us just kind of blurt out up here. Thank you for being here. Certainly appreciate what you have to do. It's a difficult job and fraught with a lot of tough decisions. And so a couple things. First, I have a second question, but the first one is, are you doing any sort of roundtable discussions out in I think of my communities along the Humboldt, other areas of the state? Are you engaging with water users, water right owners, or water right holders on how they can offer even suggestions on how they could conserve, how they can better manage? Just wondering what the outreach is from the state engineer and your office.
Thank you for the question, Adam Sullivan, for the record. Absolutely. We are making this a priority with the, coming out of the pandemic. It really helps us give opportunities to have public meetings. And the issues and the solutions and the concepts are really local and site specific. So it's important to have that sort of public engagement. We've held recent meetings in Lovelock and Winnemucca and Elko to talk about issues on the Humboldt River. We have a meeting coming up next week in Overton to talk about the Muddy River. We have 2 meetings in Smith and Mason Valley in April to talk about issues with the Walker River. We have a continual engagement with the community in Eureka to discuss the groundwater management plan. So to the extent that we can, we are prioritizing that. It's especially important now with the drought and the sort of acute water shortage issues. But the priority is to help people navigate water law, to share the data, to talk about what the options are and the consequences, and how our office, given the limitations, can be a partner with local communities in coming up with practical solutions to the local problems within the umbrella of Nevada water law.
Thank you. And yes, I do understand that you've been constrained with the pandemic. I know that you're recently, new to this position, so I'm glad you could get on the record that you're going to make these efforts, and I'm sure it will be well received. That personal one-on-one, or your office being involved in these communities, I think will be a real boon for people to have a voice and hopefully provide you with some really good information. The second thing I wanted to address is, could you give just so that the public that might be watching and those who might not understand conjunctive management, could you give some examples of conjunctive management that's used now, or even some hypotheticals that you'd like to see?
Adam Sullivan, for the record. Again, the thing that comes to mind really is how site-specific it needs to be. Looking at the local hydrogeology, looking at the water use, and I would say it's, as far as implementing it from the state level, it's in its infancy. It's a concept that was only introduced into, or recognized, I would say, in the law just recently. Historically, there's a different set of rules for administering surface water sources from groundwater sources, and it's been a challenge to recognize the hydrologic realities within those constraints that are built into what everyone's relied on for generations in some cases. So as far as examples, it becomes most acute in river systems that are losing, and you have the most senior rights at the downstream end. So you have the surface water right at the most senior surface water right at the downstream end of the system. And there's a number of challenges with just practically and climatically and socioeconomically in how that can go forward in a smart way that follows the water law and follows the science. Examples: the Humboldt River is really where is at the forefront. I would say, right now, of what that can look like and how we can do something that's effective for the long term for the people affected.
Thank you, Chair, for the indulgence, and thank you. And to that point, no real examples yet. Yes, this is still new. That's what makes it hard, and hard for people to understand in these communities when they don't have something concrete that they can actually, if they're going to be the guinea pigs, there's some understandable concern over it. So I think having test programs, that sort of thing that we can offer up, whether it was with the sage grouse and doing some studies and doing some things that we could get some data from, having some of that kind of information, I think will help all of us to get a better understanding of how this might be a possible solution to a very difficult problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, additional questions?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have one.
Mr. Ellison, go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation. But I do have I hear a lot of concerns out of the Humboldt River, of course. And say you've got ranchers that's got water rights on downstream and groundwater. So they, for years, have been using irrigation. Now all of a sudden they're going to go to pivots and they go to groundwater or go to wells. So at that point in time, does that water permit come from the groundwater? And we're talking ranchers that are close right to the Humboldt River. So isn't that creating the problem with determining, them water rights? And seems like to me that's where the biggest discussions are coming from, and is the upstream users and the complaints. So maybe you can hit on that, but you can see these people had water rights for years and not as much as the ones downstream, and that's going to be challenged eventually, but you still have somebody that's got downstream water rights and also surface water rights. So they went from the surface and went to drilling wells. So can you describe that or give me some ideas?
Adam Sullivan, for the record. Thank you, Assemblyman Ellison, for the question. And you hit on some of the real difficult issues, and it's been very helpful to have public meetings in up and down the river system, because you get different perspectives and different questions and different ideas about how to manage it depending on where you are, and what we're trying to do is move forward in a way that people really understand, and I see that as one of the benefits of those meetings, is that over time there's been a more of an understanding of the different perspectives and the realistic limitations of a limited water supply. I don't have an answer for how to do it, but it all takes time.
Follow up, Mr. Chair. Is some of these upstream water rights going to be challenged, do you think? That's what it looks like to me, that these people are going to have to challenge some of these new laws coming on the books, or lose a lot of their water rights. I think that, I don't know, the people, the upstream are the ones that are having the problems. Lamoille, some of these down that way. Is that going to be more of a challenge and a cost expense that's going to go back on you? Yeah, that's what it's going to have to be.
It is a challenge. It puts a lot of pressure on our office to work with a limited staff and limited tools to not create more problems than we already have, and work towards solutions, and not make really draconian decisions that cause more harm than they serve to specifically address the problem, and make the water go as far as we can, and not honor the prior appropriation system, but also allow as much beneficial use under existing water rights, groundwater rights, as we can.
Do you want to stay up north, Mr. Chair? I've got a question.
Sure, thank you. Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I need to clarify now, you said Diamond Valley was the only critical management area. I thought 161 Pahrump was also a critical management area, even though it's over appropriated but not over pumped. Am I wrong in that?
Pahrump is not designated a critical management area. It was discussed for a long time, and it was didn't go forward. Pahrump, or Nye County, does have a groundwater management plan for the Pahrump Basin, and part of the reason for doing that was to get ahead of that problem and not be designated a critical management area because of some of the concerns that might have.
All right, thank you. I guess I thought it was a CMA. Then a follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chair. And I agree wholeheartedly with the update in the science. We have to know what water is available and have an accurate computation of what we've got in the bank. And I, to this committee and to all my colleagues, we need to fund this. And if we don't come up with the science that says, hey, this is what's available, we'll never know whether we're over-appropriated, under-appropriated, over-pumped. And we talk about changing water law. Let's find out what we've got in the bank first. So I really appreciate your presentation, Ms. Fairbanks. Mr. Sullivan, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and I appreciate those remarks, and also understanding that this is Natural Resources currently and not Interim Finance Committee, but do appreciate having some of those issues raised, and I do appreciate the division for limiting those to the half of the last slide, because I do know that resources are a significant issue across state agencies. Other questions from committee members?
I have one.
Senator Scheibel.
Thank you. Senator Goycochea inspired and confused me with the critical management areas, because I also thought that Pahrump was a CMA. So can any community develop a groundwater management plan, or are there other ways to qualify other than being a critical management area?
Adam Sullivan for the record. So a critical management area, it can be, a community can petition the state engineer to designate it as CMA, or under certain circumstances, the state engineer could designate the CMA on our own. It's something, as I see it, it has some significant consequences, so it's not something that I would be inclined to go forward with without the community support. It has to be a single groundwater basin, and it has to be in an area where pumping consistently exceeds the estimated perennial yield each year. So it's not just necessarily being over appropriated, but it's over pumped. Those are the basic rules. I think, as far as the consequence, well, I'll add to this. What happens in a critical management area is that the local community is then responsible for developing a groundwater management plan for the long term, and the state engineer needs to approve that plan. And if that's not done within a period of 10 years, then the state must curtail by priority. So the consequences are severe. And right now, like I said, we're awaiting the Supreme Court's ruling on Diamond Valley going forward, and depending on what comes out of that, I think that will be a good building block to see how this can be used effectively in other parts of the state.
Okay, but I thought that you said that Pahrump already had the groundwater management plan, even though they're not a CMA. Did I misunderstand that?
You understood that correctly. Pahrump has a groundwater management plan, but it wasn't created in response to being designated a critical management area. Just like Las Vegas Basin has a groundwater management plan, there's lots of good reasons and ways to develop a groundwater management plan, but a CMA would require that a community needs to develop that.
And do all groundwater management plans have to be approved by the state engineer?
Only in the instance of a CMA. However,
Okay, thank you.
the state, you know, we do work with other communities, with Pahrump, with our municipalities, to help make a groundwater management plan effective.
Right, and I would assume that the groundwater management plan still has to fall within the parameters of the Nevada law. So it would have to follow the first in time, first in right rules. It would have to follow any other parameters that are set by regulation or law about how we allocate and how we use water, right?
Yes, it doesn't supersede any other water laws.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions from members of the committee? I do have several, so I think I'll jump in with a few and then we'll open it up to see if it's inspired some for others. I guess one thing, just to briefly revisit conjunctive management issues. And again, I think the presentations are helpful. Sometimes I like to zoom out a little bit just to kind of put a finer point on the issue. And it seems to me that, with many of these issues, but particularly with conjunctive management, it's something that, especially as science has evolved, it clearly supports. And, we understand that, for example, when there's irrigation, that some of that water goes down and recharges. And so similarly, I think it's become clear that when you have groundwater and surface water close to each other, that there's interactions between those two, and that a water law system that treats them as completely separate leads to some double counting. Unfortunately, addressing that means that there's going to be some winners and losers, I think. So I was just wondering, is that kind of an accurate summation of some of the issues? Is that we've essentially kind of, as the science has evolved, it's created a situation where adjusting our rights and our water rights and our law to that essentially creates conflicts?
Yes, I think that's a fair characterization. And so now we're in a situation where we need to figure out what's the smartest way to move forward that honors the prior appropriation system, but also protects existing users as much as we can within a realistic knowledge or understanding of what the water budget is.
Thank you. I'd like to revisit something that you said on the issue of curtailment, and you discussed that obviously it can be draconian, but it is essentially the hammer that we have under water law as it stands currently to protect against over appropriation, over pumping in particular. You mentioned that there are potentially some areas where there's kind of a lack of clarity. So I was just wondering if you could, one, refresh kind of the committee on whether curtailment by priority has occurred in Nevada, and what some of the issues are that you see on its potential application to bring a basin into balance.
The points I had about curtailment by priority is that it can be, I didn't say draconian, but that's a good word, and it can also be ineffective. We manage groundwater rights on a basin scale, so oftentimes when we're looking at concentrated shortage, it might be within one particular area, and to strictly curtail by priority, you might be curtailing those who wouldn't, if you curtailed in a certain area, it wouldn't affect anybody else over a really long period of time. So you have to be realistic about what the implications are, those for the local community affected. Another example is you might have let's say your municipal water supply in a small community has the most junior right in a basin. For the purposes of health and safety, it doesn't make sense to curtail the most junior right with that sort of an impact on an area. So although it can be a tool in how we deal with this. I think there's a lot of unintended consequences of using that as a strict and the sole basis for decision making. Did that get at your
Thank you
question?
for that. No, I think it does provide some additional clarity on some of the complications and details. I know that there was legislation within the last couple of sessions addressing kind of that health, safety, and minimum use when it came to domestic wells. And I think that is a broader issue in terms of ensuring that the most basic water needs of people are met in some of these dire circumstances. And I will, I think, come back around to domestic well issues, shortly. I guess I'll take a pause for a moment and see if there are any other questions from members that have come up so far.
Mr. Chair, if I could just plug in a few.
Senator, go ahead.
Thank you. And I guess just to get it on the record, we've got 256 basins. All right, presently, by my numbers, 129 of them are either fully or over appropriated. And of those, 49 are over pumped. And again, I'm just coming back to, does those sound accurate to you?
That sounds approximately accurate to me.
And so I guess, again, and that's why I continue to plead my case, yeah. And then if you happen to be, and I always challenge this, say on the Humboldt River system, in which we've got all these basins, of which a number of them do have groundwater rights and surface water rights and supplemental rights, and yet technically they're in the same basin. They are being recharged by that river system. Would you agree to that?
Yes, it's very site-specific, and the hydrologic setting in different basins around the state can vary tremendously.
Okay, so you don't agree with that, okay. But anyway, that's where the real catch comes with conjunctive management. So, all right, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just don't think we can diminish the fact that we do have some really bad numbers out there that we need to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And I do agree with that. I think that leads into another question. I'll take it again a little bit bigger picture. What are some of the policy options that could be used to deal with overappropriation and particularly overpumping in the state?
Well, I go back to some of the things that I discussed during the presentation. I would say from a policy standpoint, going back to creating incentives for water conservation that can be implemented. And I draw the distinction here between what our municipalities can do within a system where they are the sole water right holder and they have a customer base. That's a really good system for being able to implement conservation and incentivize it. But where we have a large area where everybody holds their own water right, and it's on a prior appropriation, sort of a use it or lose it type of a basis, what can you do to incentivize or promote conservation in that setting? And then, on a second matter is this question of critical management areas and groundwater management plans. That's another avenue for local communities to develop effective plans. And I think there's some room there, policy-wise, to add some guidance and some certainty about what can or cannot be done, and still be within other parameters of water law.
Thank you for that, Mr. Sullivan. Let's move over to funding, and I appreciate there was some distinction in some of the things that you addressed, and it's obviously a recurring concern among members of the legislature in terms of some of the one-time funding, and so there's a discussion of some of the modernization and some of the scientific updates that would be one-time kind of expenditures versus some of the ongoing staffing needs that you discussed, which require sustainable ongoing funding. You also discussed incentives for conservation. I think there's a policy aspect to that, which I look forward to us, I think, having a more robust conversation about moving forward, including on our May public lands meeting with some of the other public lands meetings where we get different stakeholders to provide some of their perspectives on what some of those policy incentives could look like. But there's also financial incentives needed to undertake many of these conservation initiatives, which again comes back to the issue of funding. So could you speak a little bit to what are some of the funding options through kind of fees, assessments, and other things within your agency, and if there are any kind of options, barriers that you see in terms of being able to bring in some revenue kind of at your agency level to support some of the staffing that you have, in addition to, of course, general funding. I know this is starting to get into the financial sector, but specifically thinking about some of the financing opportunities that are within your agency, I think does have a bit of a policy connection.
Thank you, Assemblyman Watts. Micheline Fairbank for the record. I'll go ahead and take this question. With respect to the funding issues that we have, our agency is supported through various different funding mechanisms. We're predominantly funded through general funds, and that's not revenue-based, or it's not fee-based. We do collect fees, but all of our fees are set in statute. About 4 sessions ago, there was a proposal where they tried to go ahead and structure our agency to be proportionally fee-based, based upon our fee revenue. However, our fee revenue generally only brings in about $3 million per year, and which is about 1/3 of our actual operating revenue or operating budget. And so that was not a feasible fee structure and revenue source for the agency, so that was ultimately reversed. The other portion of revenue that supports the work of the agency is through our basin revenue accounts, and those basin revenue accounts are assessments in designated basins where we have assigned an assessment. Those assessments are based upon per water right, or based upon basins where we have municipal use as the predominant manner of use. Then we do an ad valorem assessment. So Las Vegas Basin, the Truckee Meadows, those are ad valorem assessments where our rural areas are, where the irrigation is the predominant manner of use, are done on a water right basis. Those basin funds are used to support work specifically to the benefit of those basins. And so we use that to fund non-classified employees, basin specialists who do the work and are assigned to do the work within those basins, as well as operating costs to support that work being done to support those staff members. When we talk about the constraints and the needs and other funding mechanisms, that's one of the challenges that we face is 85% of our budget pays for our people. So when we have to do budget cuts and those different types of things, there's very limited areas for us to make those cuts, and it impacts the type and manner of services that we have. Certainly with the availability of ARPA funding, we're looking at that as to try to do some of the budget patching. We had to use basin funds to offset general fund, which was not preferred, but it was the only mechanism we had to avoid having to lay off 11 staff members. But we do believe that the state, it's an obligation of the state to restore that funding out of general fund. Also, we do acknowledge that that is an ongoing cost, but it's an essential cost to just maintain the minimum level of services that we're providing at this point. We're also looking at, utilizing ARPA funding to help do some of the one-time costs. State Engineer Sullivan, you mentioned the Water Resource Initiative, and that's to update our basin budgets. That would be an appropriate and responsible use of ARPA funding to help fund that on an upfront basis, and that would support that work over the next 5 years plus. The Modernization and Digitization Initiative that has been spoken of, there is an ongoing cost component to that, but it's also an essential cost component if we're going to go ahead and bring our agency into the 21st century. We say it sometimes tongue-in-cheek that we're still operating in 1903 data management. Every single file is a paper file. And while it's good to have paper, and some of our historic records certainly have, some sentimental value and historical value as a state, it's not a benefit to the public to have everything in paper. If a water right user in GABS or in Caliente wants to review their permit file, they either have to contact our office and we have to make a photocopy of that and mail it to them, or send it via electronic delivery, which takes staff time and resources, or alternatively, they have to drive to Carson City to physically view that file. That is not a public service, and that's not efficient expenditure of state funding. So modernizing our systems, digitizing our systems, and allowing for us to actually operate in the 21st century is a critical need of the agency. That is where we're currently funded, and how we're operating is not satisfactory. In terms of other funding, the bottom line is as an agency, we are responsible for administering and managing all of Nevada's water resources except for the Colorado River. And if the state wants to go ahead and continue to prosper in economic development and public health and social justice and all these other priorities of a state, you can't do that without water. And if you don't prioritize funding the agency that is responsible to support that, then you're short shifting the entire state for how we're going to proceed on a forward-moving basis.
Thank you. I believe we have a question from Assemblywoman Bilbray Axelrod.
Thank you, Chair. I believe this would be for the state engineer, Mr. Sullivan. I was just wondering, are residents in Las Vegas Valley, are they still allowed to drill domestic wells? Do we still allow that?
Thank you for the question. I depending on where this goes, I might need Micheline to help me answer this question. But the answer is yes. What we're doing now in following up on the discussion that you heard from Mr. Ensminger, if you have a what we're telling people, if you have a water right, you can drill a domestic well and use that water right to support that. But there's different kinds of constraints and concerns about the water resource in the Las Vegas Valley, and we are trying to work carefully with SNWA as well as other entities to allow what's permissive in water law and make that consistent with good water management policy for that basin.
Follow up. I'm surprised by the answer. I honestly thought it was going to be no. So is it just sort of a blanket? If you have water rights, you can do it. Does it matter proximity to water line? I mean, is it just this blanket? If you have the water rights, you can do it? Or is there some sort of, do we look at each request individually, or just curious? Thank you.
Assemblywoman Axelrod, Bilbray Axelrod, Micheline Fairbank for the record. To follow up on your follow-up question, the reason it's not a blanket now is because there are certain circumstances and locations where drilling a domestic well is the only viable option to go ahead and support the construction of a residential dwelling. There's other constraints. So we do look at it on a case-by-case basis. Clark County has implemented certain lot size restrictions. So a lot size has to be 1 acre for most of the area. Some areas of the basin require at least a minimum lot size of 5 acres for the drilling of a domestic well. We also look at proximity to city water, but we also look at whether or not there is availability or practical reality of obtaining service. So by allowing a domestic well that is utilizing an existing water right to drill a domestic well, we're not actually increasing the demand to the system because that's an existing water right, unlike an exempt domestic well that does not have to have a water right. So that would be an additional draw on the system. So we do have some limitations and there are restrictions, but we also have to recognize the practical reality that exists in the need to supply properties and homes with water.
All right. Thank you for that. Members, additional questions? All right. I know that we're going through a lot. I have a couple more. One of the things that I wanted to ask about as well would be to revisit would be forfeiture, which you discussed earlier on in your presentation, and you discussed kind of some of the potential challenges that exist there. I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit more, kind of what's been happening in that area. Yeah, have there been any successes around that? What are the barriers that you see, and is there any opportunity for streamlining when it comes to forfeiture or abandonment, while also making sure that it is a deliberate process to give folks the opportunity to make sure that their rights are protected?
Adam Sullivan, for the record. We don't like to be in the business of taking away water rights, but there is a clear process in state law for forfeiture or abandonment if water's not actually being used, or if there is no intent for that water to be used in the foreseeable future. There are also a lot of protections. We recognize that it's important, again, to protect other users within an area that really are relying on the water supply. So we've taken some, put an effort into, in extreme cases, really, following through and documenting what's necessary to move forward with that forfeiture. Generally speaking, those decisions are commonly appealed, and there's a matter of working with the district court to understand what goes into that and what the implications of either of approving that or overturning that could be. And I think there's a recognition that it's a difficult thing to do. But it is necessary. It is not a streamlined process. It's not something that we are really built as an agency to be able to handle effectively on a large scale. It's a case-by-case, one-by-one sort of operation. And again, we have, I said 6,000 extensions of time per year, but maybe let's just say 1,000 of those are extensions of time to prevent forfeiture. And those are individuals where we've sent the owner notice that water hasn't been used for at least 4 years or more. And they're, submitting extensions of time to prevent forfeiture of those rights. So we process a lot of those, but we don't have a lot of depth to give the attention that's necessary for each one of those cases.
Thank you for that. And the last thing that I want to do is circle back around on domestic wells. And I'm sure this is going to be sending out alarm bells across the state. But could you speak to a little bit to, I know there's been significant issues with domestic wells in Pahrump. Could you speak to kind of the most recent developments in Pahrump around domestic well issues? And could you just refresh kind of the committee on how the interests in domestic wells are separate from water rights, and how those kind of interact? I think probably in discussing the Pahrump issue, you'll get to that, but if you could just speak to that briefly.
Thank you, Assemblyman Watts. I'll go ahead and take this question. Micheline Fairbank for the record. So with respect to Pahrump domestic wells, so since the state engineer issued Order 1293A, which prohibited drilling of a new domestic well in the Pahrump Basin without the relinquishment of 2 acre-feet of a water right. And the significance of that is that under Nevada water law, a domestic well is exempt from having the requirement to have a water right. So it's exempt from the requirements to obtain 2 acre-feet of water to serve that domestic well. What that also means is that that domestic well is not subject to the other perfection requirements under the statute. That is equipping the well, the works of diversion, and then proving it beneficial use and certificating the right. So in the Pahrump Basin, 1293A was in response to the significant groundwater declines, the over-appropriation of the basin, and just the extreme conditions. That decision was challenged, and it was ultimately upheld by the Nevada Supreme Court that found that we had the jurisdiction and authority to regulate domestic wells in that manner. And so in Pahrump, there is that requirement that a 2 acre-foot water right be relinquished. And what the effect of that is it helps to offset the additional draw of those new domestic wells within that basin, as well as taking additional water rights off the books. So it's one small step in an effort to go ahead and bring some balance to that particular basin, given the significant issues that there are in that particular groundwater basin. Overall, with regards to domestic wells, there's a lot of different issues and challenges that are localized. Certainly where you have concentrated domestic wells, you have concentrated issues with regards to effects on groundwater levels, groundwater supply, and those different types of things. And that's not isolated to Pahrump, but there's other locations throughout the state that eventually are going to have to go ahead and have attention drawn to them, because it is a concern. Other issues that arise are, where we have, kind of referring back to Assemblywoman Bilbray Axelrod's question with regards to drilling domestic wells in municipal areas like the Las Vegas Basin. That does create additional challenges, particularly if you start moving forward and you have the water supplies expanded in those particular areas and you have existing domestic wells. And say you didn't have a municipal water supply within reasonable proximity of that parcel at the time the well was drilled, but several years down the road now you have a municipal water supply. What is the responsible resource management for that particular location? Is it to have both the municipal water supply in the service territory with domestic wells, or are there other resource management decisions that are appropriate for that particular location? And those are really localized issues that are specific to the particular basins and communities, but we certainly enjoy being engaged in those questions and those processes to try to find appropriate resource management in those locations, as well as what's appropriate for statewide policy management.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that there are a lot of local nuances. I do believe personally that because of the different status of domestic wells, that it is one of the most difficult remaining elements to deal with within our water law, because they do not require a water right. And so in a fully appropriated basin, domestic wells can continue to be drilled and utilized, even in an area that's not only over appropriated, but even over pumped. And I think that there should be some additional discussion around a statewide policy to address that, to account for domestic wells within these basins, while also understanding some of the the regional differences in the actual impacts that they can have. Because while in many basins, 2 acre-feet alone may not be much, again, we've seen the concentrated issues, and if we're already, if we, under our current system, we do things by basin, and a basin is already fully appropriated, and particularly if it's already being overpumped, it seems that, to go back to language used by the Southern Nevada Water Authority, the first step that we want to do is stop the bleeding and prevent the problem from getting worse, so that it does not become more costly and more conflict riddled when we work to unwind it moving forward. So, members, last chance for any questions for our panel.
Mr. Chair, if I could, there's one thing I'd like to make sure it's clear and get on the record.
Sure, go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sullivan and Ms. Fairbanks, I just want to get this on the record. Now, you are required by law to notify a water right holder prior to forfeiture that right is subject to forfeiture, and they have a year to cure it?
Yes, that is correct. And beyond that year, they have the option or allowance to file for an extension of time also.
But you do have to notify them that they are subject to forfeiture?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I think that concludes our questions. Thank you again to both of you for your presentation on these issues and answering all the questions. We appreciate it. With that, we're going to move on to the next item on our agenda today, which will be a presentation on emergency preparedness and climate issues. We are going to be joined by the Division of Emergency Management. I believe we have Mr. Fogerson joining us from Carson City. So again, we'll allow some time for our panelists to shift. And Mr. Fogerson, whenever you are ready, you can announce yourself for the record and begin.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. Dave Fogerson, Nevada's Emergency Management Homeland Security Chief. I appreciate the opportunity today to talk to you about the emergency response, hazard mitigation, resilience, and probably the effects of climate change that we're seeing on the increase of disasters, whether it ebbs and flows. And that's what I like about the term climate change, is climate gets better, climate gets worse. We just have to figure out how we fix those issues moving forward to pare down the number of disasters, pare down the cost of disasters. Emergency management's in kind of an odd world. We're not in charge of anything until the disaster strikes. And then everyone looks at us to lean forward and do the work. And so we do a lot of we do consequence management for the cascading impacts of these different emergencies. So I'd like to walk you through a little bit about how we do emergency management and talk about some of the disasters we've seen in the last couple of years. And we can discuss how that is being affected by climate, how that's being affected by the environment, how that's being affected by the growth of our state, and items that we probably need to take into account. And we've had great discussion today about the water and the drought issues. And we've had, I saw last meeting you guys heard from Forester Casey and hearing about the wildland issues. And all that rolls up together to, we're not looking at this as a water issue. We're not looking at it as a land management issue for wildland fire. Emergency management looks at it as all hazard. We want to bring all the friends to the party to have that conversation about how we fix things moving forward. That's what we're good at. And the division is a proud part of the Office of Military. July 1st of 2021, we did move from the Department of Public Safety over to the Office of Military. Still, a lot of people still think we're over to DPS, but it is very proud of all of us to be able to work for General Barry. Probably the best boss I've ever had in my life. So we are Nevada's essential disaster coordinating partner. You'll see on the slide, it's our typical vision, mission, values, and goals that all state agencies have. But you notice through ours isn't about doing stuff. Ours is about bringing people together and having conversations. Ours are building resilience through coordination and partnership. Our goals are getting people together in effective teams to handle those issues. Because we're not the subject matter experts, but we're the people who have to know those subject matter experts and bring them to the table. whether it's a state water engineer, whether it's the state floodplain manager, whether it's the climate scientist, whoever those folks are, whether it's state forester, those are the people that we convene together to have these discussions about what's going on and how we move forward better. And then how do we respond to that disaster the best. The process that emergency management uses, it looks really pretty in the slide. It's a great circle, and it looks like it feeds from one to the other, to the other, to the other. In real life, it's not this pretty. But what we do is we prevent disasters from occurring. And some of our disasters we can prevent, some of the disasters we can't prevent. But the ones we can, we start taking those pieces to see how do we reduce that impact of that disaster? How do we prevent that disaster from occurring? How do we prevent the disaster from being so severe? Then we also look at protection. How do we protect people from that disaster? How do we protect the systems, the critical infrastructures of our state and all of our residents and our visitors? Then we look to mitigate. How do we reduce the impacts of that? And we'll talk a little bit later on about our hazard mitigation program that we manage for the state and funding we have in some of those processes moving forward. And then we respond. But emergency management really doesn't respond like you think of. We're not going to be the first responders out in the field. We're going to be the people making sure those first responders and the local government partners have got the pieces that they need to make the right decisions and the right help at the time. And then we recover from that disaster. And some of these recoveries are pretty short term. Some of these recoveries are very long term. We're still working on the 2017 floods. Those are still open disaster recovery methods, or open disaster recovery. And we recently received a grant from the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the tune of $600,000 to buy those homes around Swan Lake, so we reduce that impact again in the future. And that's kind of a mix between the mitigation and recovery piece, how we do things moving forward. We always try to look at emergencies being locally executed, state directed, state supported, or state guided, state directed, and federally supported. We want the locals to be able to solve the problem themselves. The more we get the locals to be able to solve the problems themselves, the less we have to be involved with the process. When it exceeds their capabilities, that's when we lean in to help. But as you know, the state doesn't have a tremendous number of resources, and we really saw that through COVID. We had the Nevada National Guard to be able to supply those resources. We don't have additional resources that are just sitting around to apply. And so a lot of the times what we do is state directed, state guided to find them the resources either from nonprofit agencies, from other local municipalities that aren't affected, or from other states that can assist us. And then after that part, we go to the feds for assistance. And I love telling our story in pictures. Down the bottom there, this is the part of the Nevada Emergency Operations Center. And through the COVID disaster, we've had FEMA embedded in our operations center. We've had the CDC Foundation has provided us 3 employees that are embedded in our emergency operations center. And then we have the Nevada National Guard there. And it is really a community partnership that's making all of this work together. And that's what emergency management excels at. So our main hazards in Nevada are earthquake. And you think of that protect and prevent, we're really not able to do that much in that earthquake realm. People talk about earthquake weather, but yeah, we can't change the weather that well. But if you look at our other hazards, a wildland fire, flooding, severe storm, extreme heat, drought, and pandemic, those are all areas that we can work on preventing, protecting, mitigating, responding, and recovery from, and bringing together all those parties. And the upper picture here, this is the Tamarack fire that burned from California into Nevada. We lost a number of homes in Nevada as a result of it, and had the largest evacuation of Nevada's population in our history. And then as a result of those fires, here's some debris flow that we saw post-fire. And that's what we're looking at with the mitigation activities, is how do we keep that fire from becoming this mudslide event that closes the road in the future? How do we buy down those risks? That way we have better opportunities to reduce the future impacts of that disaster. When you look at 2021, 2020 was kind of a 2021 was the oh my gosh year. 2020 had a big disaster with COVID, but we only had a couple of other smaller disasters. We had an earthquake that damaged Highway 95 that NDOT had to declare disaster in order to repair. We had a wildland fire in the city of Reno that burned a few homes October, November-ish. And remember that time frame, October, November-ish, because that's not normal fire season. When you look at 2021, the things that Emergency Management Homeland Security were involved with, the COVID pandemic, off the chart. Hopefully we never have to repeat any of those things, but we had to do a lot with that. But while that's all still going on, we're dealing with these incidences, and I think that this is a good segue for some discussion about the future of what we look at for disasters. We start with the Dixie Fire. Dixie Fire was the first fire to ever cross the Sierra Crest in the United States history. We've never seen a fire cross the Sierra Nevada mountains. Dixie Fire crossed it multiple times. We are heavily involved with evacuations of residents into California and in Nevada, and that coordination piece should that occur. Tamarack Fire burned in California, burned into Nevada, creating some burn scars that you saw from, I believe Casey talked about last meeting, some of the reseeding efforts that we're taking to try to reseed that effort, so that way we don't have flooding and debris flow in those areas. Caldor Fire, that was probably our biggest incident last year outside of COVID, never hit state of Nevada. Our local firefighters, Lake Tahoe Regional Basin, along with bringing up firefighters and law enforcement officers from Southern Nevada to support them, were able to hold it in Christmas Valley. But that fire entered the Tahoe Basin, and then we had to evacuate all those evacuees into into Nevada from California. The Caldor was the second fire to ever burn over the Sierra Crest in U.S. history. 2 fires, same year. And everyone remembers the media accounts of those. That was unprecedented fire behavior on both of those incidences that we saw. Then we see Highway 50 snow closure. That was just a little thing. You know, Christmas, we had a nice white Christmas in northern Nevada, and that nice white Christmas closed all of our roads in and out to California, trapping all those Californians who come over for tourism season for the holidays and were unable to return. Caltrans was able to open Highway 50. All those people jumped on Highway 50 to try to get out, but Caltrans was also checking for chains and was having to use snow control, so it was very slow going. People were trapped in Lake Tahoe in 8 hours in traffic. We had to declare an emergency because that night another foot of snow was going to fall on them, along with the cold weather, and those people were not prepared for those conditions. So I had to declare a state of emergency, evacuate, shelter those folks. Back in October, northern Nevada saw 3 inches of rain within a 24-hour period. We thought between the 3 inches of rain in October and then the large snow event for Christmas, the drought's over. Stephanie from the state climatologist, Bunny Bishop, the state floodplain manager, and I were jubilous that, oh my gosh, we're out of the drought, this is great. But we know drought's in with floods, so we got to start thinking about that. Yet then we saw all the weather get turned off. And even though we've had 2 significant weather events, we're still in a pretty significant drought for the entire state. Down in the south, you weren't forgotten in any of these disasters. Nye County had some significant flash flooding that washed out some state highways and washed out part of the town of Pahrump. Moapa washed out some state highways and part of Moapa, all for the monsoon season that we see in the south. These events seem to be getting more frequent and with more severity than in the past. So my worry to bring to you is that I think there's an increase in frequency. And I know Forrester Casey talked about this. We don't have a fire season anymore, we have a fire year. When I started Truckee Meadows Fire in 1994, we hired seasonals in the month of May, so that way they'd be ready June 1st. We laid them off in September, and we did not go to fires outside of those months. Since that time, when I retired from the fire service 18 months ago, we left our brush gear on the apparatus at all times because fire season came at all times. I fought better fire in November and December and January than during the summer, and a lot of those fires we fought during those months are in our urban interface areas where we're not only losing homes, but in Washoe County, in 2 of those instances, we've lost people as well. Increase in severity. Those 2 fires, Caldor and Dixie, burning over the Sierra Crest. The drought just continues to seem to get worse. Significant weather events, hotter temperatures, the rain downpour events. 3 inches of rain in northern Nevada in 24 hours when we only get 7 inches a year. Significant event for us. And then those snow events. Increase in costs. I had to throw pandemic up there, but we can't really use the pandemic as a look for the increase in costs. But when you look at the government accounting office, they're actually looking at disasters are costing us more because they're becoming bigger and badder. And so we have to figure out how do we turn down the impact of these disasters over time. And then increase in those exposed. If you look at the state of Nevada and our population in the last few years of where we were and where we are today, we're getting more people coming to our state. And while we are rural in some areas, we still have that opportunity to make sure that we have effective building codes, fire codes, urban interface codes to reduce that impact of those issues before we start moving more people into our communities. So what we try to do is we try to do resilience. And resilience is bouncing back and returning to a previous state after disaster, after disturbance, but hopefully with some adaptations that it's better than what it was. And this is hard at times when we start talking hazard mitigation. The federal government likes to pay you to get it back to the way it was pre-disaster. But if we made it the same as it was pre-disaster, are we not setting ourselves up again for the future, such as those houses in Swan Lake? If we let those houses get rebuilt and stay there, are we not going to see them flooded when they have the next disaster? And Nevada doesn't have a lot of those types of examples, but we see that greatly on the Mississippi and the Gulf Coast and areas where they do have those recurring disasters. So we want to be able to build back better than what we were before and adapt to our issues. And we do that through our mitigation process. Nevada is one of 16 states nationally that has an enhanced mitigation plan. That means that we get better funding from the federal government after disaster. Every year, this federal government provides us funding that our division uses. We have a hazard mitigation grant program and then a new program called the Building Resilient Communities and Infrastructure, BRIC. These two programs fund our hazard mitigation programs to try to buy down those risks and reduce the impacts of future disasters. We also get post-disaster declaration monies. And there's two of those. One is such as COVID, we have a disaster declaration, so we were able to receive $14 million for the hazard mitigation funds from the federal government to apply to whatever disaster we wanted to buy down in the future. We also have hazard mitigation funds from post-fire management assistance grants. So whenever we have a wildland fire that affects predominantly the urban interface area, we don't have to declare a disaster. We can ask for what's called an FMAG. And the regional administrator can approve that rather than having to go through the process of a local government, the state government, the federal government. The local government can go directly to FEMA and ask for that declaration. Following that disaster, following that fire, we get hazard mitigation funds that we can spend not only to reduce that fire risk, but reduce the flood risk and reduce all those other risks that are associated because of that wildland fire has occurred. The division's role is to coordinate. We plan, we collaborate, we fund, we support. And we're really looking at those cascading impacts and dealing with that consequence management. And some of those things moving forward that we're doing that haven't been done before is a state heat plan. We know that temperatures are rising. We know that people are becoming more exposed to higher temperatures. We know that Las Vegas is probably hotter now than it's been ever before. And that's not just because during COVID, I was down there walking around in a suit during COVID, and man, was it warm down there coming from the north. So what we want to do is be able to find out ways where we can buy down those risks, and we can use hazard mitigation to do that. We can design a heat plan. We can find ways to reduce the impact of that to our population. And one of the ways we're doing that is we're funding a study for the city of Las Vegas for a microgrid that would be attached to cooling centers. So that way when we do have a high heat environment, the city can find places where they can turn on cooling centers for people to go to. But looking at how does that happen now if because it is so hot, we lose power? Is that now tied to a solar system? Is it tied to something else to make it better? We're working with the University Medical Center in Las Vegas on a scoping project to give them a solar panel that would be able to power the facility, and they can sell energy back on good days, but then also have storage. That way they don't have to rely upon generators to fund their site or to run their site during those crappy days when we don't have power because we do have energy issues. And we see that also up here in the north when we start looking at turning off power on high-risk wildland days. And NV Energy will turn off power on high-risk power days up in Lake Tahoe Basin. They'll do it along the Genoa foothills. They do it at Mount Charleston, and I believe they have a location also in eastern Nevada that they do that as well when the conditions hit right. And so how do we make sure that the populations that are in those areas have got power when the power company turns their power off? How do we make sure we have fuel lines still coming over to Nevada from California when those issues occur and the pumping stations get turned off? Those are all that mitigation process that we look at. How do we make tomorrow better than today? Seems like disasters are occurring more frequently, a little more bigger impact. So DEM's trying to figure out how do we step up to become more aggressive in getting the right partners together to have those discussions to make sure our state stays better tomorrow than today. So with that, I got 2 last slides, and I wouldn't be your emergency manager if I didn't ask you, do you and your family have a plan and a kit to survive for 72 hours? Can you survive right now if we had that no-notice earthquake? Do you have your disaster kit with you? Does your family know how to contact you? Do you have all those links in place in order to stay ready? If you go to ready.gov or you go to the DEM website at dem.nv.gov, we have links there on what you should have in your disaster survival kits for at work and for at home to make sure that you're ready for that. So with that, I'd like to open up for any questions you might have. I'd like to highlight this picture here is a phenomenal picture because last year was the first time that we used a state interstate mutual aid system to move Clark County resources, City of Las Vegas resources, and Pahrump Fire Rescue resources to northern Nevada in support of the Caldor Fire. And this is Tahoe Douglas Fire Station up at Lake Tahoe being staffed by Clark County Fire. And they ran calls and they actually went into a commercial structure fire at the grocery store in South Lake Tahoe while they're up here managing this incident. We had to bring them up because we were out of firefighters in the north, but we couldn't send Clark County Fire to the fire itself because they didn't have wildland fire training. But they were able to cover that fire station with their firefighters, with their paramedics, their battalion chiefs, in order to allow the local responders to then go to the wildland fire. So a great avenue of cooperation through our state to how do we make tomorrow better than today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Fogerson. We appreciate it. Members, we'll open it up for questions.
I've got one, sir.
Okay, Mr. Ellison, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. I got 2 questions. Just a few minutes ago, I just got a text that said that President Biden just issued a warning of cyber warfare against the United States, and that just come over the phone. What are we doing to prepare for that? I mean, because you're talking gas stations, you're talking hospitals, you're talking all this stuff that could happen. So could you answer that? And then I got one more after that. So.
Absolutely, I'd be honored to answer that one, Assemblyman. Dave Fogerson for the record. I think a month to 5 weeks ago, we saw this coming, and so we produced a policy team, and it is engaged with the Department of Administration, Department of Public Safety, Office of Military Division of Emergency Management, DMV, we added to it because of their high utilization of cyber needs, and some other essential partners. And we meet every Monday at 1:30 to have a discussion about what the impacts are going to be, to make sure we can advise the executive branch of the government on what we need to do. And then we actually have also brought open our Emergency Operations Center, and we brought in what we call our emergency support functions. So that is the state police, the NDOT, all those different components thereof. And we talked through what would happen if we had these different cyber issues. We gave a non-classified brief on the issue and did that. And then the following week, we've actually met with our local government partners and our major utilities to have a discussion about this could happen. This is what we know. We don't know. We don't have a crystal ball, so we can't predict. But this is what we're thinking might happen. And so you need to start leaning forward and thinking. And a lot of people are doing a lot of leaning forward right now to make sure that we're ready for this. I can guarantee you that when it happens, we won't be ready for it because we don't know what could happen. But we're ready, having those conversations on a weekly basis to what do we do, how do we do it, and how do we make sure that we're resilient through this process. And we're also looking at what policy issues we need to change moving forward, especially with cyber, because cyber is the odd disaster. And this was hard for a lot of people to understand, is that with an earthquake and cyber, the end effects for us in emergency management are exactly the same. We have to figure out how to shelter, how to evacuate, how to feed, how to communicate, do all those same things. but the nexus between those two are so much different that people are used to that earthquake, but that cyber has that, oh my gosh, this is really scary, really scary type stuff. And trying to, the end result is the same. It's what we do every day, and that's what we need to focus on. And I know our cyber staff of OCDC, Sean Ronmeyer with the Department of Public Safety, and then Bob Denhart with EATS, they're working their fingers to the bone trying to make sure that all the cyber folks are all together and having those discussions, those meetings.
Well, thank you. And the other question I had, you kind of answered some of it. It seemed like we're having a lot of increases, more in small earthquakes across Nevada. And I've seen earthquakes where we've never had them in rural Nevada, and there seem to be more frequent all the time. Are you guys seeing the same thing throughout the state?
Assemblyman Dave Fogerson, for the record, absolutely. We're seeing, and that's the point of this presentation. It seems like more things are occurring more frequently, and we're becoming more aware of them. And I don't know if it's because social media is making us more aware of the earthquake risk, but it seems as if we are having more of those smaller quakes on a more routine basis. We've had a 6.0 here in northern Nevada. We had that one last year out in yours and Senator Gokachia's land where we had some problems with one of the schools and looking at some dams. They do seem to be occurring on a more frequent basis.
Thank you. And I do have bug out bags.
Good.
Thank you very much. Members, additional questions?
Mr. Chair, I do.
Okay, go ahead, Assemblywoman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fogerson. It's been very insightful. Two questions, one about fire and then the other one about good old Swan Lake. What do you have the data? I'm not expecting you to probably have this right at your fingertips, but do we have a general idea what percentage of fires? I know the fires last year, it was a horrible year. We dodged a bullet in the sense that they weren't necessarily in Nevada, but certainly we suffered the consequences of those in our quality of life and just the emotional toll it took on a lot of communities. Do we know what percentage of fires are human-caused on the ground versus storm, lightning, wind, that sort of thing?
Assemblywoman Dave Fogerson, for the record. I don't have that information with me, but I know that the Geographic Coordination Center does track that, and Casey is a state forester, can get that data for us. There is probably a disappropriate number of human-caused fires than naturally caused fires, but we do have some kind of phenomenon around the northern Nevada area where we have more contacts from lightning that actually make it to the ground that do cause an increase in lightning starts than probably most areas outside the country or outside the northern Nevada area.
Okay, thank you. And if you could get that information to our committee, that'd be great. I do think maybe Director Casey touched on it in our last hearing, but I didn't make any note. The second question was when you mentioned Swan Lake, I knew there had been a process to perhaps buy those homeowners out, the homes that were affected. So where did that money come from? How many homes were affected, and did they buy 100% of them, or did some people opt not to be bought out? Sorry, that was a trick question. It was 2 with 3 questions in it.
Assemblywoman Dave Fogerson, for the record, absolutely understand, and I'm looking to see because I got the notes from that this morning, but I don't know if I have that level of detail. I know it was a $600,000 grant from the Federal Emergency Management Agency in order to buy out homes, but I'd have to get back to you on how many we actually bought, how many were offered, and those other details.
Great. If you don't mind, that would be very helpful. And also, I'm assuming market value, our even if they live in a flood zone, crazy as it is, our market values are a little off the chart. So just if you could get those numbers, it'd be appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. And I will note that in the backup materials for Ms. Casey's presentation to our committee at our February meeting, there is a slide, I believe it's slide 7, that has a breakdown of total starts for wildfires and how many of those are human caused, as well as acres burned and how many of those are human caused. And There's generally been usually lightning starts were the vast majority of starts. That has actually been shifting in recent years, and often some of the acres burned on an ongoing basis have tended to be human caused. So the human ignitions tend to lead to more acres burned. So I just wanted to put that on the record for all members. Additional questions from the committee? All right. I think that concludes our questions for you, Mr. Fogerson. Thank you very much for your presentation today. Thank you also for providing a bit of an update on the heat planning initiative that the state's undertaking. I think it's also important to not only understand that extreme heat can be dangerous to people, but thinking of it at a disaster scale and understanding the increased demands that puts on our electric infrastructure and making sure that we have some plans in place to deal with it. I know that we've had some scenarios when we've been asked to cut back our energy use to make sure that we don't have blackouts, which could be extremely detrimental to folks. So thinking about some of those grid resiliency pieces, I think, is really important to that conversation. So I just wanted to note that as well. And thank you for your time and presentation to our committee today. With that, we will move on to the last presentation on our agenda for today, which is going to be on waste management and sustainability efforts in the state. We have members of the Partners for a Sustainable Nevada initiative joining us in Carson City, which includes folks from our Division of Environmental Protection, as well as some of the stakeholders involved in that group. So with that, we welcome you. Once you get settled, go ahead and introduce yourselves for the record, and you can begin whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, Chair Watts and members of the committee. For the record, I am Jeffrey Kinder, Deputy Administrator with the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection, presenting today on waste management and sustainability efforts in Nevada. Within NDEP is our Bureau of Sustainable Materials Management, and joining me today is Darren Winkleman, Bureau Chief, and Kayla Alm, Sustainability Coordinator. The Bureau has several roles as it relates to materials management. First, the Bureau is responsible for ensuring safe management of hazardous waste by regulating its handling, transportation, treatment, storage, and disposal. The Bureau implements the provisions of the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. Second, the Bureau ensures the safe collection and disposal of solid waste. And third, but no less important, the Bureau encourages businesses, institutions, and individuals to reduce the amount of waste generated, participate in recycling programs, and conserve natural resources. Additionally, our team prepares the Recycling and Waste Report each biennium ahead of the legislative session. We look forward to presenting that report next year as we continue to look for opportunities to improve our data collection and presentation. While our role in the management of hazardous and solid waste are conducted within a regulatory framework, our role in sustainability is less prescriptive. We appreciate the opportunity today to share the important sustainability work our team at NDEP, along with our partners, are doing. With that, I will turn things over to Darren and Kayla. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Chairman Watts, members of the committee, for the record, my name is Darren Winkleman with the Bureau of Sustainable Materials Management. Thank you for allowing us a few minutes to talk to you about the Partners for Sustainable Nevada. Several years ago, we as an organization recognized an opportunity to kind of redefine our philosophy regarding waste in Nevada. And our agency began a shift from end-of-life waste management to an entire life cycle approach, also known as sustainable materials management. During this transition and through our strategic planning process, we received a tremendous amount of feedback regarding the lack of communication, cohesiveness relating to sustainability in Nevada. One solution to overcome the patchwork was to create a stakeholder group where like-minded, passionate people could discuss sustainability challenges, but more importantly, a group that could affect change within the state. So we began the process of creating the Partners for Sustainable Nevada, and Kayla will provide a little more detail in a moment. I would like to stress that NDEP is the logistics behind the partners. We provide the forum and the structure, we support their meetings, and make sure the decisions are captured and available to all the members, making sure that the groups have a platform for these discussions. Ultimately, we want the group to grow and become self-sufficient. With that, I'll turn it over to Kayla to give you a brief overview of the group structure, what has been accomplished, and the future ahead.
Good afternoon, Chair Watts and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Kayla Alm with the Bureau of Sustainable Materials Management. The Partners for a Sustainable Nevada held their first kickoff meeting last August of 2021. Several surveys were sent to interested stakeholders about the parameters of sustainability that they view as important to support and collaborate within Nevada. The survey results were then compiled into 6 working groups, each led by a chair and co-chair. The first phase of the stakeholder group was to discuss in deeper detail the status of their working group topics and what needs to happen to further their objectives. The work is currently being compiled into a document called the Menu of Options that will be published on March 31st. This document will outline various ideas or options that all sectors and industries can consider to further their sustainability efforts. The second phase will be prioritizing and implementing programs for the remainder of 2022 and onward. During the kickoff meeting, we facilitated an exercise to develop a mission statement. With this, all sectors came across with one common goal: to change the way Nevada thinks about sustainability. Once the working groups gained some traction, the Sustainability Working Group created a definition for what sustainability means to the entire partnership group. These 2 phrases have created a foundation for which the stakeholder group will move forward. The 6 working groups outlined on this slide are run by a chair and co-chair who volunteered to be in their position after the August kickoff meeting. Represented are nonprofits, private businesses, and governmental representatives, which provide a broad representation of opinions in each working group. The Education Outreach Group is going to unite the sustainability message to audiences around the topics discussed in other working groups. The Organics Management Group will discuss and streamline the different organics collections, such as yard and food waste, and promoting beneficial end use of this material. The Policy Change and Funding Group will streamline policy ideas and create broad communication routes for legislative and policy proposals. The Recycling Group is working on increasing recycling opportunities, starting with multifamily residences. The Source Reduction Group is focusing on reducing the amount of waste that is generated. And finally, the Sustainability Group is working on uniting the broader topics of sustainability and inviting additional stakeholders to the conversation. The 4 working groups noted on the left side of the slide are idea-based, while members are focusing on a single topic and outlining options to improve their focus. In order to present a single message and again unify collaboration and communication, the Policy Change and Funding Group and the Education Outreach Groups will eventually take over some programs to push forward. This will ensure that the mission statement of this partnership group is met, to change the way Nevada thinks about sustainability while providing a united message. Once the Menu of Options is published on March 31st, the chairs and co-chairs are convening to prioritize what programs outlined in this document need to happen first and start creating the baseline projects to elevate their focus areas. Once baseline projects are decided upon, project-based groups will be created to coordinate efforts. An update meeting will be held in September 2022 to provide an update to all projects that are occurring and to further outline the next steps for this stakeholder group. We are very grateful to have several organizations throughout Nevada who have stepped up and participated in ensuring the success on sustainability in Nevada by participating in the Partners for a Sustainable Nevada. Thank you for listening to our presentation on the great work being accomplished by all of the organizations statewide to unite the voice of sustainability. Do you have any questions for us today?
Thank you very much for your presentation. We appreciate it. One thing I wanted to do before I open it up to questions is see, I know that we had some conversations with Tina Mudd, who I believe is one of the co-chairs of the Policy and Funding Group. And so if Tina is available and would like to speak at all, I wanted to provide her the opportunity to come up and do so.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Watts and committee members. For the record, Tina Mudd, Granite Construction Environmental Manager, as well as the Policy and Funding Chair. I really just wanted to compliment NDEP staff and this team for putting a really diverse group of folks together. I think the benefit of this group is that it's a diverse group. As Kayla mentioned, business, industry, nonprofits, municipalities, as well as folks representing initiatives in their communities. And I think the benefit of that is we're looking at what's being done right now and building on what is being done and doing better before we introduce a bunch of new things. And then on top of that, we're also looking at how we can do things efficiently and make sure we don't have unintended consequences with the things that we propose. So we are looking to some of our neighboring states and counties and partners to see what's been done well, and I think staff has brought us a bunch of ideas from other areas for ways that we can progress in a really meaningful way. So I just wanted to say thank you to the staff for doing what they're doing for Sustainable Nevada and also including such a diverse group of folks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the time that you and others have given to this effort. I think it's important. We've seen waste management issues, of course, come before the legislature at various points in time, and without saying anything about whether some of those efforts are positive or negative, I think often they've been brought forward by kind of one stakeholder, and then there's usually a response to that. So I think it's really helpful to get this broader conversation going among all the different stakeholders in kind of waste management, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of the process. We also appreciate you being flexible and presenting to this committee now. I understand that it's a little bit early because you're in the process of finalizing that kind of menu of options to be considered, and so we look forward to seeing that when it comes out, but really appreciate you briefing the committee on what's been happening so far as well as where things are kind of looking in the process moving forward. So with that, I'd like to open it up to members for any questions that they have. And we do have a question from Assemblywoman Bilbray Axelrod.
Thank you for indulging me. I was just curious about recycling. I know there's been a lot of anecdotal talk, at least among my peers, that there's really not a market for purchasing things that are recycled, and therefore a lot of things that we intend to be recycled are not being recycled. And I also think that there's sort of we don't really inform our consumers on what's recyclable and what's not in a meaningful way. I find myself questioning even myself and having to go on the Republic Services website to see if something can be recycled. So I just was wondering if you could address those issues. Thank you.
For the record, this is Kayla Alm, and that is exactly, excuse me, why the stakeholder group really came together. There's a lot of questions from multiple people throughout the public, and this is something that the recycling working group is going to be working on, then eventually pushing out through the education and outreach group to ensure that there is a uniform and united message going out to all stakeholders. Does that answer your question entirely?
Just the first part about, is there a market right now for currently to buy? I know in the past, China had been one of the largest purchasers of recycled material, and I have heard that that's all but not happening anymore, and I was just wondering if you could address that. Thanks.
Absolutely. And so recycling is dealt within most of the private sector, so you have the Republic's, Waste Managements, and other waste-focused companies throughout the state. And it's constantly shifting, really. We've been trying to gather some more information about where the material is moving, so that way we can, again, bring those areas back to these different working groups to see how we can better help and suit Nevada's recycling infrastructure. So it is currently being addressed. And I think with that, if you want any other further data, we will be submitting the recycling report coming up this next legislative session.
Thank you very much. Senator Scheibel.
Thank you, Chair Watts, and thank you guys for your presentation. I am optimistic about this group. I'm glad to hear that we are, honing in on some of these really important issues that Nevada has struggled to address for, decades at this point, including recycling, one of my personal favorites. And I have a couple of questions. The first one is that I understand that the menu of options has not been published yet, but it is going to be published. And so you guys are sitting here with us on March 21st. Can you give us a preview what some of the projects, what some of the options are, so that we can get a sense of the scope that this working group is talking about? Is it going to be, we're going to install signs that say throw away, or recycle your aluminum cans, or are we going to be building a facility that is able to process aluminum cans into new aluminum cans or new products and actually recycle those?
For the record, this is Kayla Alm. Absolutely, I would be very happy to give you more of an insight of what will be published here in the next 10 days. So as you saw, there are 6 different working groups, and each working group has put forward anywhere from 5 to about 25 different programs. So this is a very extensive plan that we're coming forward with. Most of the projects that we're going to be starting with are our baseline data collection projects. In order to further these different products, we need to see really where are we standing today, because we don't want to, again, jump forward like Tina mentioned earlier. We do not want any unintended consequences. So we need to see where is sustainability within these 6 different working groups standing today. I think one of the most notable and exciting projects coming out is really within our organics management group. They've been discussing a lot with the food waste and yard waste. How are we going to collect, process, and transport then that material, and then eventually utilize that end material? So I think there's a lot of really fun and exciting projects coming out here in the next several weeks. And like I said, a lot of these projects are going to be these baseline data collection, so we see where we are at today and where can we further expand.
I have a couple of follow-ups. The first one, who's footing the bill for these projects?
We have Tina here with our policy and funding team. And so, yes, that funding is a very big portion of this stakeholder group, and we need to identify what are some funding sources, and I think even more importantly, where is funding needed? In order to acquire funding, we need to see what projects out there need support moving forward. I think one of the, again, touching your last question on the projects that are coming out, is we are going to be redoing the Nevada Recycles website into more of a Sustainable Nevada website. And so this is something that NDEP currently utilizes, and so we do not need funding to start off this very first project starting up.
Why would we change the website from recycling to Sustainable Nevada?
Absolutely, great question. So sustainability is all-encompassing. Recycling is a single part of sustainability, and so we're still going to be keeping a lot of the same material from the Nevada Recycles website, but we're going to be amplifying and bringing in more topics to this website. So instead of just recycling, we can now be discussing the organics management. We can be discussing, like you mentioned earlier, the funding, how we're going to be funding all of these different projects. There's going to be source reduction and how we can reduce our waste generation. So we're going to be taking the recycling information and it's really amplifying to encompass the entire sustainability message.
I'll move on. I'll move on from that question. Then the last question I want to cover today is about the long-term planning, I guess. And you mentioned that the groups will be coming back in September for a status update, and it sounds like in the future for a status update. So what is the mechanism to get these projects from start to finish, as opposed to start to inception to never completed?
Again, a very wonderful question, one that we have been discussing, thinking about bringing in our chair and co-chairs. So, bringing together the stakeholder group, we were noticing a lot of those projects would, just like you said, they would start up, have this wonderful idea, and then just never really complete the project. And so I think really by bringing in these chairs and co-chairs and stakeholders at all industry levels, the private, nonprofit, municipality, and government levels, this will bring in all the stakeholders that are involved and have a passion for these different projects to ensure that we're going to be meeting and completing the project proposals from beginning to end. So that is something, as the stakeholder group moves forward with, we are having, like I said, the chair and co-chairs and other project leads who are going to be managing and ensuring that the communication collaboration continues throughout the process.
Thank you for that. I'd like to just follow up on that briefly. Could you, and I know this is looking pretty far into the future on the process, I guess I'll just ask at a very high level, do you see this as a process that is going to be kind of an ongoing thing to some extent, where this stakeholder group is going to continue to have meetings on some sort of regular basis? It's this, even though there's kind of this immediate planning process, and then I think you discussed even how some of that is envisioned moving forward into implementation kind of through the end of this year. Is this something that you plan on continuing to convene and gather feedback from on an ongoing basis for the foreseeable future?
Absolutely. The status of the stakeholder group now, we hope to expand and continue on really for the duration of Nevada. I think there's a lot of other very successful stakeholder groups that are managed in other portions of the nation that are showing great success. And in doing so, they've been starting at these smaller kind of grass level roots where we are today. Eventually, us as NDEP, if we would like this stakeholder group to become self-sufficient. As Darren mentioned earlier, we are here to provide that foundation to really bring everyone together, create this stakeholder group, and then in the future, when the stakeholder group is ready and has the buy-in and commitment from chair and co-chairs and other partners, this can now be a standalone stakeholder group.
Thank you very much for that. I just, again, really appreciate that, really appreciate the approach that looks at these issues comprehensively, in terms of even just expanding from recycling to recycle, reduce, reuse. So really taking a comprehensive look at the waste stream, as well as organics, composting, food waste reduction, which is separate from other types of waste reduction, and really kind of taking a comprehensive look at the issue. So do we have any members in Carson City who have questions for our speakers?
I do, Chair.
Go ahead, Assemblywoman Hanson.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Enjoyed the presentation. Really like the idea of those working groups, kind of a public-private, mix. That's very important. I just wanted to follow up. I'm not sure if you can completely answer this, but to follow up on the recycle question, selling off recyclables that my colleague in the South asked, that there's not as much of a market anymore. And I think you mentioned that it's the private side that's selling these offshore. Is there any reason that they're not having a market in the United States per se, due to regulations that would prohibit them from using those, so then they're going to markets where the regulations aren't as strict?
That's a very wonderful question. And I think something that Tina's been touching on with the policy side is how can we start looking at what current policies are in place and creating barriers for sustainability. At this point, I don't know right now if we have any actual barriers to bring in those different facilities for recycling within Nevada and the nation. We do have several facilities who are able to process material both in Nevada and the rest of the country. But I do not believe that there are at any point any policy barriers. We're trying to focus within the policy and funding group on incentivizing these different industries who can come in and start keeping this material in Nevada. I think that's something we can reduce the transportation of material, create in-state jobs for Nevadans. So that's something where how can we take the material that we are generating within the state and keep it within the state.
Oh, good. I appreciate that. And then just my final thing on we talk about the organics, like we're talking about composting, I assume. And I'm still just learning about this, but I do know there was a fire in Spanish Springs a few months ago, and that it was really an issue, air quality and all of that. Is there a higher incidence of that sort of fire, and it's just a smoldering? It's a very, I guess, difficult to mitigate it when it's happening. So are there pretty strict, in fact, how do the fires start? Is it like self-combustion, that sort of creates gases that then catch fire? I'm just trying to understand the process.
Yes, so a lot of the windrow compost, where you have just the large piles of material composting within each other, they get really hot inside, and they will, just like you said, they will self-combust and just smolder within. They're very hard to put out, and there's all the material, a lot of material and feedstock to feed these fires. I think as far as preventing these fires is, we have these different permit requirements from the state and the local health districts. And within that, the facilities have to test for temperature at various intervals. And that should be a lot of the prevention side. However, there are different pockets of materials. Some materials can generate different gases that can get hotter. So it really does lead to just maintenance on the facility side. But it's a pretty rare for these different fires to happen. They can be very well prevented, and that is in, again, their permit requirements.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Other questions from our members up north? Although I will just say, yes, I think it's always interesting hearing about some of these issues, especially as they approach larger scales. Again, and there's nuances to all of those. But I have done small-scale at-home composting, and it's never combusted, but it is, I think, really interesting to see in the winter, kind of the steam coming off of compost, especially as you turn it, because those microbes are at work. It does heat up. So, additional questions from our members up north? All right, hearing none at the moment. I did want to ask about a couple of things. One, just to put a finer point on it, I know there were some questions around financing and policy, and there's a financing and policy work group that's going to kind of, I think, bring some ideas, whether it's in legislation or regulation or other avenues. But when it comes to financing some of these, I guess I'm just looking for some clarification that there could be a range of options and opportunities. Some of those may be, generating and using revenue at kind of the state or local level, but some could be executed by the private sector in terms of taking on different education initiatives. Is that correct?
Chairman, thank you. This is Darren Winkleman for the record. You hit the nail on the head, and that was the biggest, one of the biggest ideas of creating this partnership was to bring together both private and public so we could start to really address some of those issues. Or how are we going to fund some of these larger projects that are coming down? How do we get maybe an anaerobic digester in the state, waste energy facilities in the state, some of those topics that may or may not be good. I'm not saying we want either one of those, but just those discussions around how do we begin to look at that. And we had to have that private partnership to do that. And I think that's where this group is moving forward very, very quickly, and will come hopefully with some of those recommendations either through the next session or in some interval of that. So we're headed that direction. That's where we hope we can go.
Thank you very much. And my last question, which I also I'm familiar with because I've had the opportunity to sit in on a couple of the meetings of the partners. Could you speak a little bit about the solid waste management plan that the division has and the process of updating it, and to what extent some of these broader sustainability principles may be incorporated into that solid waste management plan, which I think is a little bit narrower, or at least traditionally has been.
For the record, Darren Winkleman, thanks for that question as well. We are in that process. That plan is due every 5 years, and this year it's September of 22, I believe. So we have opened up that plan to begin to look at solid waste to get in Nevada. And when we opened up the plan, we said, let's take a look. We believe, in all honesty, that the plan is pretty weak. And it talks really, it's a narrow focus plan of just solid waste in Nevada. We wanted to open that up in sustainability and really begin to look at, like we said earlier on, kind of this holistic approach of waste management within this state. And so we are kind of, I guess, for lack of a better term, knee deep in that process. And we have a lot of people working on the group to bring that plan forward. We don't have a deadline right now of when that's going to be. Hopefully by the end of the year is what we're shooting for, but that's just kind of our goal. And yeah, it's an exciting time because we've have a great opportunity to really look at the plan and kind of look at, again, holistically for the state.
Thank you very much for that. And again, thank you for coming and sharing with us. I think this is another great opportunity. It sounds like there's already a lot of diverse participation in this work group, but seeing as how the hope is that it's going to continue on for the future, I think this is another opportunity to get the word out about it to the community for anybody who would like to participate who isn't already, and to help shape some of the policies and initiatives that are going to be affecting kind of our waste management strategy in the state. So we really look forward to seeing the menu of options that comes forth, as well as some of the initiatives that are undertaken by the partners moving forward, and look to evaluating any options that relate to the legislature in addressing, supporting some of these things, or even just looking again at how our state addresses them from a fundamental planning perspective to make sure it's a little bit more holistic. So, members, any last questions?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, real quick.
Go ahead, sir.
For the record, Darren Winkleman, I would just like to say thank you to Tina. Gave us a lot of kudos, but really the kudos go to these guys. We have 6 chairs and 6 co-chairs that are running these meetings, making it work, trying to bring all the issues forward, trying to corral a lot of different people, and so they really deserve the credit. And the people that have come as stakeholder members deserve all the credit. We're just here to make sure it works and it moves forward with them and provide that support. So again, thank those guys for truly making it work.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And yes, we definitely appreciate all those who have been involved in this process. But I do want to recognize the division as well for bringing this together. Again, I think there's a lot of potential benefit from undertaking this process and getting such a diverse group of people together to talk about these issues at such a kind of broad and interconnected level. So glad that we were able to get that information out. Again, encourage anyone who's interested in reaching out to the division to join the partners if they have not already. And thank you again for your presentation to the committee today. We very much appreciate it. So with that, we have arrived at the last item on our agenda for today, which is our second period for public comment. Again, for those wishing to call in and provide public comment, please dial 669-900-6833. When prompted, please enter meeting ID 870-5012-2791 and then press star. Our broadcast and production services staff will indicate to you when it's your turn to speak. Please remember to clearly state and spell your name and limit your comments to 3 minutes. So with that, we will again begin by seeing if we have anyone wishing to provide public comment in person, either here in Las Vegas or in Carson City. Seeing none in Las Vegas. One of the benefits of having all the plexiglass put in the legislature is I can also see when people are approaching the testimony table. And seeing none in Carson City, thank you. With that, BPS, can we see if we have anyone wishing to provide public comment via phone?
If you would like to offer a public comment on today's meeting, please press star 9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller 332, you are unmuted and may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Patrick Donnelly. I'm Great Basin Director with the Center for Biological Diversity. We're in the worst drought in recorded history in the Southwest, so when the state's top water official comes to you and says we are badly under-resourced, that should qualify as an emergency. State engineers' pay rates are not comparable with private industry, and during the current employment upheaval, they have lost substantial staff. You can see this playing out in their operations. For instance, new water right applications aren't being scanned and uploaded to the DWR website in a timely fashion. You may know your neighbor just applied for a whole bunch of water, but you can't see the application to know whether or how to protest it. State Engineer's Office has always been under-resourced, but there's concern that it could be verging on dysfunction currently. While this committee is not a money committee, members should take urgent action to ensure the state engineer has the resources he needs at this time of urgent need. We also desperately need the one-time allocation for basin budgets. We are using perennial yield numbers from a different time in water science and a different climate epoch. Data presented in the lower White River flow system proceedings show that in some aquifers in the Mojave Desert, it turns out there's functionally zero recharge, except in the most exceptionally wet years. We're using a hydrologic model of water out that's based on science derived in wet places. Turns out most of the groundwater people pump in Nevada fell as precipitation decades, centuries, or millennia ago, reflective of a different climate regime. Mr. Sullivan was talking about over-allocated. We don't even know which basins are over-allocated. It's probably most of them. We need to fund that science. But the state engineer also needs to make the tough choices. We heard Mr. Sullivan say, we try not to be in the business of taking anything away. But how could that be in a state with widespread over-allocation of groundwater resources? How can we possibly balance the books if the state engineer take anything away? We heard curtailment by priority described as draconian, but why should it be? If someone at the end of the line is pumping water that just isn't there, they should lose that water right. The answer isn't to mess around with the law to allow gimmicks like water markets. If the pumps need to be shut down, shut them down. And finally, we need to reckon with growth. Mr. Ensman here on the topic of growth, but if you read between the lines, it's clear. The only reason Las Vegas has been able to grow as it has is because of unprecedented water conservation measures. At some point, you just can't conserve anymore, and you've got to start limiting the new water users. Proposals like the Clark County Lands Bill, which will add tens of thousands of acres of new residential development and residential irrigated landscaping, propose to negate all of Sunwa's great conservation work by overloading the system with consumers. If we don't address growth, as Mr. Ensminger pointed out, Sunwa will need new resources, and historically that has meant enormous contentious pipelines to rural groundwater basins, a road that none of us want to go back down. Thank you for your attention to this important topic today.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Donnelly. BPS, let's move on to the next caller.
Thank you, Chair. The line is open and working, but there are no other callers wishing to offer public comment at this time.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, members, for your time and attention. We got a nice 4-hour meeting in, which is exactly kind of what I was aiming for. So we powered through and folks can go and get lunch and get about their day. The last thing that I wanted to remind everyone of, our next meeting as the full committee, Joint Standing Committee, will be on Thursday, June 16th, and that is planned to be a joint meeting with the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Health and Human Services to look at some of the health impacts related to climate and environmental issues. So a special joint meeting. Lastly, I want to note that in between now and then, our subcommittee on public lands will be meeting in April, May, and June. And the first meeting of that subcommittee will be in Ely, Nevada on Friday, April 16th. So with that, again, I thank you all for your time. Thank everyone who was able to come and participate in person. It's good to be back to full hybrid meetings, and we're glad to welcome participation in any form. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.
I think Friday is the 15th, Saturday is the 16th.
Oops. All right, it's Friday the 15th for our subcommittee on public lands.